are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the September 23rd edition of the vBrownbag US, troubleshooting a vSphere deployment. So my name is Chris Williams. I'm the host, and hold on, where? Change. There we go. Our guest today is Jack Kramer. He's a VCP6-DCV. His Twitter handle is at Sathanis.com. Did I pronounce that right, Jack?
Yeah, it's a long story for that one, unfortunately.
Okay, and his URL is jacklkramer.com. Hosting with me tonight is Anthony Hook. Welcome to everybody that is in attendance, and I'm going to change presenter over to Mr. Kramer.
Hi, friends.
And you have the floor, Jack.
All right, and I've just watched my PowerPoint crash, and my printed notes aren't coming out of the laser printer, so we're just going to throw up my Word document. And it's going to be exciting. It's a bold new frontier, also known as my lab environment quit on me.
As he gets ready, if anybody has any questions, feel free to shoot out any questions in the questions channel. Hi, Graham. I'm waving to you throughout a question. I'll watch the IRC channel on Twitter, and we'll interject questions as we go. So be as interactive as you want or as quiet as you want, and we'll go.
Give us a little hootenanny.
All right. So hopefully everyone can see the beautiful Word document I have up here.
We can see it, yes.
Excellent. So this was supposed to be prettier. I'm sorry, everyone. I came home and the NAS for my little lab environment, which is literally a couple of laptops and an Ethernet switch, was giving me that forlorn little blink. That means my SSD just bit it. So that's on its way back to Amazon. And in the meantime, I'm doing this. So we're going to do this way. We'll pull up some of the vSphere and VMware documentation as we go, and hopefully you guys are going to have a lot of questions, because otherwise it's going to be kind of dry. So the first thing I wanted to cover, for anyone who's taken the VCP5 and who's taken the VCP5 training, especially, it was always focused with install, configure, manage, you're looking at this objective and going, wow, there's a lot of stuff here. And when I looked at this, that was my first reaction. Then I started looking through it, and this actually is a lot of the stuff I did on the VCAP-DCA. So I did actually talk to VMware Education about this, and this is one of those things they're doing because there's now that VCA-DCV exam. So a lot of the stuff that was all the easy gimmies that was on the DCV, they pushed that into the VCP. The stuff that was easy on the VCP has been pushed into the VCA, the associate exam, kind of like Cisco does with the CCNA. So this is all effectively been upgraded. So we'll see what they're going to do with the new VCIX exam, but a lot of this was the stuff that you wouldn't have seen on a VCP prior, which is why this objective is so ridiculously long. But so we'll start with kind of your objective 7.1, which is to troubleshoot the servers and the hosts and the VMs themselves. This is kind of your catch-all. So the first thing we got here is you're monitoring your vCenter server status. So the main thing here, obviously, if you go to work one day, you can't log into your vCenter. The first thing I always do is I pop open your services.msc. You want to see if your vCenter service is even running, because the service might be running but might be in an unreachable state, but it may also have just stopped. So it's a gimme, but it's one that's easy to forget in the moment. And then the next thing, okay, so your service is in a stop state. The dependencies. Make sure your inventory service is up. Yeah, not necessarily a dependency, but it is if you're going to be using the web client. So if you're trying to log in through the web client, you can't get it that way. That might explain that. Make sure your web management services are up. And then the next thing you want to do if everything is down is go to your vCenter logs. So if you look through the objectives, the logs are called out in a lot of places. They're called out again in, I've got this open on another screen, sorry. Your logs are called out again for objective 7.3, which is actually the upgrade objective, but it's relevant to everything. On the Windows host, your logs are pretty much any. This is going to be in a Server 2008 or Server 2012 because you shouldn't be using Server 2003. your logs are going to be located in program data. So if you're doing this through Windows Explorer, the first thing you got to do is make sure you're showing hidden files and folders. So C, program data, VMware, and then it's in there in the Virtual Center folder, because we're still using the old product's name. Look for the vpxd.log. That's got all the data you need to actually go and figure out, well, not necessarily to go figure out what's going on, but to at least provide the support, and that's going to give you your big gimmies, like, okay, I can't log into my SQL server, or, okay, I can't connect to SSO, or my SSL certificate is invalid, I can't establish a trust relationship. Everything you want is going to be in there to at least get you initially started, and to see stuff that's honestly a little weird. Like last week I had a vCenter that got stuck in the starting state. It wouldn't fail, so it never threw an error in the Windows services. It just got stuck starting, and when you check the logs, it was creating a new log about every 45 seconds, and that's because it was writing out a dump file. So if you don't ever check the log directory, you might be going here thinking it's just taking forever to start up, and you're actually in an inconsistent state. And it turned out that vCenter had a corrupted Atom database, and that's why I couldn't get it up. So the next objective we got here, basic maintenance of the vCenter server database. So they're talking about the SQL Server database. The SQL Server database is the main database you're going to see for your vCenter. You have SQL Express if you did a kind of consolidated install. I believe someone correct me if I'm wrong, the SQL Express limit is now 10 gigs. As of 2008 R2, it used to be 4. So that's a lot more data. That's still not a lot, especially when you start actually collecting log data. The second kind of database you have there, though, is the Atom database, the Active Directory Application Mode database, which stores information about, in 5.5 it stores information about your linked mode. In 6.0, that's part of the PSC, but it's still, the Atom database is still important. It stores your local copy of that product key information. It stores a lot of the little bits that vCenter expects to run. That's one of those databases that you never think about backing up until you've actually lost it. So it's important to at least know that that database is there and know how to back up an Active Directory Application Mode database. The two sub-bullets I got here are the database compatibility and size of the database. So these are related to your SQL database, of course. So if you did an upgrade install, we'll come back to this, but if you do an upgrade install, you need to make sure your SQL database has been upgraded along with your vCenter. And for anyone who can hear the siren in the background, I apologize for that. I'm in downtown DC, the Pope is in town, and this place is like a military base right now. So there's lots of sirens. But so you got to make sure your database has been updated, the compatibility is right. 2008 R2 at minimum, I believe, is the current one. You got to make sure, or no, that's not correct. 2008 is the minimum. But you have to make sure, like, for example, if you brought forward a database from ESX 5 and vSphere 5, that the database compatibility was updated along with that, because those had older versions of compatibility that were acceptable to them. And then the kicker here is you need to make sure your database stays in size. So remember, I was just talking about SQL Express only allowing a 10 gig database. If you do what's not recommended and you install SQL Express and then you grow and you actually turn this into a real environment instead of just the proof of concepts that SQL Express was kind of envisioned for, all of a sudden, especially when you enable logging and you turn up the log levels, you're going to be at that 10 gigs and your vCenter is going to stop. And then you're going to have to go back through. You're going to either need to purge those logs, purge performance data, or realistically, you're going to need to move to a SQL server.
Hey, this is Anthony. I'm gonna interject here for a second too. Yeah, you're right. With 2008 R2, it's 10 gigs, and I've had a few environments where they've hit that limit, and it's not fun to purge the data. And you might get into this too. So maybe I'm spoiling something, but what about the vCenter server appliance and that size limit too? Is that something you're going to hit on later?
Yeah, and then absolutely. So so right now I'm just talking about the Windows vCenter server. And
got it. I'll go sit in my corner.
No. That's a good thing to bring up. Because it's easy for me to focus on the Windows one because I almost never use the vCenter server appliance because I honestly kind of despise it.
Oh.
Uh-oh.
The VCSA, I would call the 6.0 version of the VCSA is really the first one that I would really consider usable in a production environment.
Agreed.
And it's still shaky. But that Postgres database on there doesn't have the same size limitations that you're going to see for the SQL Express database. So if you're in an environment where you are very licensing constrained, and we've all been there, SQL Server is expensive, especially if you need to comply with encryption requirements, so you're looking at SQL Server Enterprise. Or you might already have DBAs and they're using Oracle and performing the ritual sacrifices required to keep that running. You want to look at leveraging those outside resources. The Windows vCenter server can use an Oracle database, but man, you don't want to do that. The the vCenter appliance does better. Oracle really likes Windows or Linux clients, not Windows clients. And anyone who's ever had to configure Oracle to work nicely with Windows clients knows exactly what I'm talking about. The same thing with the vPostgres database that you get on the VCSA. The big advantage of that is you don't run into that size limitation you will with SQL Express. The big disadvantage to that is SQL Express gives me all the Windows management tools I know and love. Postgres is a very good database. It's a very powerful database engine. The learning curve on it is more of a cliff face. Not nearly as bad as Oracle, but it is definitely not the easiest database to manage. If you're looking for something low maintenance, and as long as you're committed to making sure you got a snapshot and making sure you run through what will end up being the restore procedures for the vCenter server appliance, I'd say with 6.0 you can actually run it. Me personally, I'm still more comfortable with the Windows installed and actually using a SQL server, and then that's of course the other thing too. The basic maintenance, they're talking about basic maintenance here, and they're just talking about checking your database size, making sure your tables are good, making sure your log jobs are running. So this will be something, if any of you guys have ever moved a vSphere database from one SQL server to another and then come across it and all of a sudden your database is 200 gigs and then you have to go back through and you have to re-add the scheduled jobs that purge and prune the old performance logs it generates, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about there. So you got to check that. And then you have to make sure you're backing up to truncate your logs on Windows. That's the other big kicker there. Especially on a SQL server, it's very easy to deploy a SQL server, forget to install a backup agent or schedule a backup job, or enable circular logging, which I don't ever do that in production, but if you got to do it, you got to do it. But you got to make sure you're checking your hard drives, making sure your database size isn't growing out of whack, and then just kind of making sure everything's healthy. Everyone knows don't shut down a database server without letting it shut down gracefully, because that's how you get an inconsistent table. The same thing goes for snapshots. If you're going to take a snapshot of your SQL server, for the love of God, please quiesce the disks, because otherwise you're not going to get a consistent database snapshot reliably. You may have to do a log rollback, and all of a sudden your vCenter is in an inconsistent state. Because remember what I mentioned about that Atom database. The Atom database and the vCenter server SQL database need to be in a relative sync with each other. Otherwise, you're going to be reinstalling vCenter. If you have a consistent database when you reinstall vCenter, pretty much everything comes back, but you're still going to have to be reinstalling vCenter, and that's never a good situation to be in. So, your next up here, monitoring the status of your ESX management agents. So I don't know if we have anyone on the as for the attendees who are more on the newbie side of things, but of course just to break it down, you have the management agent, which it would have been your service console in the old school ESX, and then you have the actual VM processes that run on top of the lightweight kernel that ESXi is based off of. So if any of you guys have ever had 4.1 or 5.0 and you've lost storage and you've gone all paths down, and you've just watched your ESX box lock up. This is one of those instances where the management agents would have failed on you. But what was always really frustrating about that is your VMs would still be reachable. So that's the first thing to check. If you lose connection to an ESXi server in your vCenter, so you're watching it, it goes gray, it's unreachable, the first thing you want to check is, can you ping any of the VMs that were last on that machine? Because you might be expecting to see HA events, but you're not going to see an HA event unless the VM itself actually goes unreachable, and unless that host itself just is completely unable to heartbeat. Because if the VM is still online, the VM is still going to be locked by that existing host. It won't release the lock. So I've had this environment, I'm sure some of you guys have run into this too, where you lose storage, your ESX is going to need to be rebooted because that management agent is totally lost in the old school all paths down type situation, but you have servers that are still running on there. So you can RDP into those servers, you can gracefully shut down those servers because they're on the storage that survived, and then you can allow them to start up on hosts that are still available. The next thing, obviously, you want to check. Sorry.
This is Anthony again. I'm going to steamroll you. There's a little bit of a delay in my audio. But that all pass down reminded me of a bug that existed back in, it was either 5.0 or 5.1 or maybe 5.5, where you do, when you do like a rescan storage, but you do like a refresh storage and you do a rescan at the same time, if you have both of those check marks checked, it would try to do one while it's doing the other, and it ended up in that all pass down state where it would get stuck and you'd have to restart the host. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's the same thing happening, or that used to happen with the management agents. It has long since been fixed. But I know you used to be able to trigger it that way when you'd have both those checkboxes. Maybe it was back into 4, I'm thinking. I could totally be thinking about 4 too.
Yeah, I haven't seen that in a while. I remember that one. That was always real. Don't ever do both. Thankfully, that doesn't happen anymore.
No, I think that was an all-pass-down bug, if I remember correctly. But anyway,
the other great all-pass-down bug, too, was always iSCSI, because iSCSI was pretty unreliable when 5.1 first came out. And actually, I had when I did a 5.1 installation the first time, I rolled back to 5.0 because of that. Because iSCSI used to be 5.1 before, 5.1U1 was just really bad. But you gained a couple nice features there too. So now, for example, we have PDL, the permanent device loss. Instead of just getting stuck and all paths down, the host will actually give up, which is good. It's also bad because if that storage comes back, you're still going to need to, at the minimum, rescan, but realistically, you're going to need to reboot that host, so you're going to need to maintenance mode and reboot it to get it to talk to storage that it's now decided doesn't exist anymore. But all paths down is now a recoverable state. It's not going to be stuck forever, typically. What you will see get stuck forever is when you have storage that's not quite bad enough to trigger PDL. So if you've got a really flaky fiber array, or if you've got a iSCSI network that just isn't quite there, that's going to get you that all paths down state, and it won't ever quite get bad enough to trigger the permanent device loss. The nice thing is NFS doesn't have that. The downside is when an NFS data store disappears, there's no, hey, I'm going to attempt to reconnect to this, and we'll come back and gracefully recover. It'll reconnect when it sees it again, but otherwise that VM's going down. So it doesn't pause the same way you would see for a fiber array or an iSCSI array. So there's trade-offs. The next thing I always check, and I actually put these out of order on here, DCUI and CLI. So if you're not disabling the DCUI, if you have DCUI enabled on your host, and I always recommend you keep DCUI enabled. And I know those of you who are in DoD environments, you're going to get knocked by information assurance because you have DCUI turned on and because people can see stuff on your box. And just remind your information assurance guy that that's why there's someone with a gun posted at the data center. But you want that DCUI because it lets you get to some of the more advanced troubleshooting stuff, and it lets you do things like enable the CLI, lets you do things like check your VM kernel log right there. So you can look in the VM kernel log and you can see what's actually going on. And if you have your DCUI totally turned off, and if you have that VM kernel console totally turned off, like the DoD STIGs say, or like some of the other high security configurations will do, you might be out of luck. It's the same thing, the same reason I actually don't like lockdown mode very much. Lockdown mode is very useful if you don't have physical security over your box, but if you don't have physical security over your box anyway, all they're going to do is they're going to pull the plug and they're going to insert a boot CD. So lockdown mode doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't get you much, and you lose the ability to troubleshoot through the DCUI. the next thing you want to do is if you have the CLI turned on, if you have SSH access turned on, can you log into the box? Can you restart the management agents manually? Which may or may not succeed, but if it does succeed, you've recovered the box. And you can, every time I have a ESX host that has its management agents go through some sort of failure, I always maintenance mode the host and I reboot it as soon as possible. But at the very least, you can go in there and you can get connected in and you can maybe see what's going on. Or even if the management agents are down, if you can get in on the CLI, you can see what VMs are running and you can shut some of those VMs down. You can hard power them off if you need to. Which there are advantages to that. Remember what I was saying, you might still be able to RDP to those VMs. So if you can RDP into the VM and you can shut down the applications that are running inside it, but you can't necessarily shut down the guest OS because that host won't release the lock, you can actually use these CLI commands to then hard power off that VM once the applications in the VM are shut down, release the locks on it, and then start it again on a working host. So you're allowing HA to then take its natural course and function. So if you have a host that you can't manage, you might not have physical access to it. It might be in a remote data center. The nearest guy who can pull a plug on it is 2 hours away. At the very least, you can CLI in, and you can hard power that off and allow HA to bring that VM up on something else. Hard powering off a VM is never great. Sometimes it's the best alternative you've got. And once again, if you have lockdown mode on and if you've disabled the DCUI, you can't really do that kind of stuff. So that's why I'm not a particularly fan of lockdown mode. So next up, these two, the determine host stability issues and gather diagnostics and monitoring the system health, I almost actually don't know why they've separated these two out. So gathering diagnostics, you're gonna generate log bundles. So you can do this with the vSphere client. You can do it from vCenter. The real preferred way to do it and the in-depth way to do it for a host itself is to actually connect in through the CLI. So you have to have your CLI at the very least available. So you go ahead, enable SSH, and I'm going to have to, because I'd never have this command memorized, but you're going to actually want to run the log generation command, which to generate a log bundle. The other thing you're going to do, though, is you actually, on the host itself, you have the logs through, once you're SSH in, you have /var/log, and you have all the logs in there. So you've got the auth log, which lets you know when people are logging into your shell. So that's good if you think someone's trying to crack you. You have the patch logs, esxupdate.log, your DHCP client log, which is useful if you're trying to troubleshoot a network issue. For me, the real big ones that are useful is the VM kernel log. So that's, obviously you have the graphical output of that if you still have your console turned on, but you have the text file of that as well, which you can then use to extract and you can send off to support. You have your warning logs, which is the VMK warning.log. And then you have your summary one, which gives you number of VMs running. You've got when the host was turned on and turned off, and you've got your heartbeat there. So that summary one is useful if you're worried about a machine that's shutting itself off and not reporting itself back to you, but otherwise it's not super useful. The one that's golden is that vmkernel.log, because that's logging everything the machine does. It's ridiculously in-depth, but you'll see stuff like, it lets you, I've troubleshot a bad storage array with that one before. I've troubleshot bad RAM that wasn't being reported in the host itself, in the hardware status, which is our next bullet here. Of course, you've got your hardware status, the IPMI. I've troubleshot a bad CPU, actually, in that one because it was reporting instructions that it just couldn't execute. And, of course, you can also see VMs that are misconfigured through that. It will report invalid configurations in the VMX files when it goes and reads that VMX in and tries to start the VM. When you call VMware, when you ask for support, they're going to want relevant VM kernel information, or they're going to want you to extract that log bundle for it. The other thing that you really need to check here for the diagnostics information, not as much as stability information, is the VPXA. So that's the communication with vCenter. So when you're troubling vCenter communication issues, which we actually have a little farther down, that one's going to be invaluable for you. All this stuff is the CLI. So if you're newer to the product, you've probably not used the CLI at all. The CLI you don't want to keep on all the time. You really don't want SSH access on all the time. It's not super useful for your day-to-day. But when it comes to troubleshooting, the CLI is your absolute best friend. So you want to be as comfortable with it as you can be. And I am sorry that my phone is going off. Let me put that on mute.
It's okay.
But that's
we have a quick question.
Yeah.
Herman Silva is asking, will this document that is being presented, is it going to be shared?
Yeah, absolutely.
If you'd like to get into, we can either have them email you directly, or you can post it on your website, whichever you'd prefer.
I can post it out, and I can email it out to you guys. Obviously, email it so it can be posted along with the recording.
Sure thing. Thank you.
But yeah, and this is Herman. I'm sorry, it's not a PowerPoint slide deck, unfortunately, but this is this has always been one of the quick sheets I worked off of. One I did is I threw that quick sheet together when I lost my lab and made sure it just followed the objectives here. So, but to move on to the next bullet here, so your hardware status. So when you go ahead and you manage your host in the vCenter, you'll have the ability to look at the host. You can see the hardware status, not just the alarms, but you also have the ability to actually check the IPMI information that the BIOS reports back to you. So not all, like if you're managing a collection of white box servers, Supermicro is kind of notorious for this. Their stuff is cheap, but cheap for a reason. The IPMI is not really great. But if you have Dell systems, if you have HP systems, if you have UCS, especially UCS is very good with this, and you're running the vendor ISOs, and I can't really emphasize that enough. I'm just going to highlight it up here. The ISO, the custom ESX build you can get from the vendor, Dell, HP, Cisco, IBM, all provide these. That's going to give you the best ability to figure out what's going on your physical hardware itself. So, for example, the HPs don't report processor status properly if you just grab the straight up VMware 6.0 ISO off the My VMware portal. You'll see your CPUs, and your CPUs are all going to show up as 0 megahertz, which, okay, not really necessarily a bad thing on day-to-day, but because they're all showing up as 0 megahertz, you can't necessarily see the speed state of those CPUs. So if you're trying to collect some advanced data, if you're trying to figure out why one host is a little slower than the rest of them, it's not reporting the actual processor state. The HP image has a tweaked hardware driver for that and does actually work. The Dell ones will properly report their baseboard management controllers, which is the Dell iDRAC. Through the Dell image, they won't always properly report it with the VMware image. I've got a Dell server right now which is reporting its IP address is 128.128.128.128, which is obviously wrong. But that one was set up real quick and dirty using the standard VMware ISO and not the Dell ISO. And then the UCS ones will report, the UCS ones will report everything when you have the VMware ISO. They'll report their chassis status, they'll report whether or not they're able to communicate back with their backplane, whether or not they're able to communicate with the upstream UCS interconnect. So you get additional reporting that you wouldn't have there. That hardware status is your best friend when it comes to keeping track of an early hardware failure. It's going to report if your power supply, if you lose a power supply, it's going to report that. So maybe you have a data center that just lost its B-side power or something like that. The data center vendor might not necessarily notify you if this is a co-location situation because they don't want you to freak out. But it would be good if you find that out because maybe a rack lost its B-side, you can move stuff over to your other rack. God forbid that rack then loses its A-side in 15 minutes. You're covered because you saw that alert, you took action, and now you prevented some downtime. So gold star for management for that. If you didn't have the ability to see that hardware status if you weren't running off the correct ISO. You might not be able to read those power supply information, and you might not have had any idea. And all of a sudden, you're looking at an HA event. Your services all go down. They come back up because HA is magical, but your services still all went down, and you have a manager who's ringing your phone wondering why this virtualization solution, which is supposed to reduce their downtime, which they just spent $1 million on, was down for 15 minutes. And that's always a really uncomfortable conversation to have. So make sure your ISO is good. Avoid resume-generating events. So, log files. vCenter logs. Your C program data is going to be your repository for all of your VMware-related infrastructure logging on a Windows box. So you're going to have your virtual center log there. You're going to have your single sign-on log or the platform services controller log, still called the SSO log. You're going to have the other PSC components. You're going to have enhanced link mode logging and everything like that in there as well. You're going to have the inventory service logs. If you have Composer, you're going to have Composer logs. If you have Orchestrator, you're going to have Orchestrator logs. If you have vRealize Automation, you're going to have vRealize logs. C program data is where it all lives. First thing you should be doing if you're going to manage a Windows vCenter is to go into those view options and turn on Show Hidden Files and Folders, because you're going to be in there a lot if you have to troubleshoot. The vCenter appliance, if you've used it recently, if you use the 601, you notice it's got a DCUI now, and you can actually SSH into the box and do some real management on it. Its logs are at var log. Make sure you know what the password is for that. Make sure write down your root password, tattoo it on your arm if you need to. One of these days you're going to have to log in. You're going to need to be able to get to all of its stuff in var log. Still the vpxd.log. But that lives in var log on that box. So obviously a Linux box is not going to be C program data. That log is going to have, like I mentioned before, it's going to have all the good stuff for you. It's going to tell you if it can't connect to the platform services controller because its SSL certificate has expired. It's going to tell you if it needs to be relinked to platform services controller because it's got an invalid leave certificate. It's going to tell you if it can't talk to the database. This is definitely a thing that can happen on the VCSA too. If your vCenter Server appliance disk runs out of space, Postgres does not like running out of space. It handles that a lot less gracefully than SQL Server. And that's going to tell you your database is corrupt and that you're about to be reinstalling the vCenter Server appliance. And Windows box is going to tell you if it can't log into your SQL Server. So you want to check your ODBC connection. You want to make sure that the SQL Server service is running. That's another thing that no one, or at least in my case, that I always forget to check until the last second. Because I'm going, why is my vCenter not starting? Why is my vCenter? Oh, wait, I have a whole SQL Server I have to manage. Those of you that have DBAs, make sure you buy your DBA some beer, stay on their good side, because that database is critical. That's also going to, on the Windows side, with the Active Directory application mode, that's going to also tell you if you're about to be reinstalling your vCenter server because your Atom database is corrupted. Because that one, unfortunately, is not rebuildable. If it's corrupt, it's corrupt. There's really, you're not getting that one back. But thankfully, you reinstall, make sure you point back to your database. Then when your server doesn't start, go look at your log, discover that you forgot your SQL Server password, fix your SQL Server password, connect back to the database, and you've got a vCenter back. The next bullet point, determining the appropriate CLI command for a given troubleshooting task. You'll notice I don't have anything under that one. This is obviously vague. The only thing you can do here is to get comfortable with that CLI. So there's two different types of CLI commands. There's the ESX CLI, which is the kind of the more modern way of doing things. And then, wow, I'm actually completely failing to remember the other CLI commands.
Was it the vim-cmd?
vim-cmd, there we go. I always want to call that vim CLI, yeah. The vim-cmd, which will get you some, So you have ESX CLI, then you have VM-CMD, or VIM-CMD, sorry, VIM-CMD, Virtual Infrastructure Manager. And what's very weird is those can accomplish the same things. They accomplish it very differently. The ESX CLI is much more modern, and it's designed around the ability to, if you've ever used the vCenter, the VMware Management Appliance, the VMA, the ESX CLI is designed around the ability to remote manage using that appliance and to remote connect back to an ESX server and to a vCenter server. The VIM CMD does not do that. The VIM CMD is a much more raw access to your ESXi hosts. Sometimes that's exactly what you want. If you're troubleshooting a network connection, vSphere standard switch or VDS, and it just doesn't want to work, sometimes Vim CMD is going to be your best friend. This is one of those ones that's really covered well in a class. I can't recommend the Optimize and Scale class enough. I took that class. It's 5. You're going to want to block off the week. Don't try to do that class from the office. Do it in person, or do it from home, remote. Close the door. Wear headphones. It's a serious class. That was 5 days of actual intense instruction. But the only reason I know those CLI commands is because of Optimize and Scale. The documentation exists. You're going to find yourself deep in KB articles before you know what hit you, and it's just not. It's not going to get better. You want that class. The professional services people and the VMware education people who teach it and who take that class know what they're doing. You get pretty valuable contacts actually in the VMware professional services side, because the professional services guys are always cycling through that class and they just know things that we don't get to see because we're not VMware employees. The support guys all recommend it. I know a couple guys at federal support, and they recommend that class pretty highly, and it covers your command line, it covers your performance, it covers actually all the stuff in this objective pretty well. And it's we've only got an hour for this QA. They give you a couple of days just on the CLI and on the performance troubleshooting. You want this class. So there's my sales pitch. I'll collect my check. But that's what you're going to have to do for that kind of stuff. The CLI is one of those things that is covered up pretty well when you manage through the vSphere client, and you manage through the web client, and you manage through vCenter. And 99% of the time you don't need the CLI. But when you need the CLI, you're going to need it now, and you want to have had training on it. And there's no easy way to dive into that. It's just, you're going to look for something, you're going to Google a problem, you're going to find usually one of Duncan Epping's blogs on something like that, and you're going to go through it, and you're going to go, wow, I had no idea this existed. That was my first exposure to CLI, trying to troubleshoot a virtual distributed switch, a DV switch. And I had no idea what I was doing. Google it. Hey, look, there's a command line command that solves it. But until you run into those kind of things, or until you take a training class, it's going to be that kind of foreboding monster just sitting over there in the corner. But it's really not bad. It's your friend. And then
I'm gonna interrupt you here again, just for one thing. I'm gonna take it back like a subject. We had a question back to the vendor ISOs.
Absolutely.
So somebody just had asked for a little bit of a clarification, specifically on the Dell one. If you install like the OMSA VIB, I think that should give you everything that would be on the Dell ISO, for instance, would it? And
yeah, so the Dell Open Manage VIB gives you the Open Manage tool. So then you can actually use the Open Manage. So Dell's got their little Open Manage package, which they usually throw in along with the pack of popcorn they include, or whatever it is they throw in these boxes these days. All my stuff has been HP for 4 years, so I haven't kept track of Open Manage as well as I should have. But the Open Manage VIB gives you the ability to plug it into Open Manage. It gives you the ability to see hardware status in Open Manage. But it doesn't necessarily give you the same blend of VIBs that you would get on that vendor, the actual ISO itself. Because so the Open Manage VIB gives you that hardware status and everything, and the plugins for the vSphere console and for vCenter. But the HP is actually pretty well known for this. Dell's done it too. The driver versions are going to be very, very slightly different. And in Dell's case especially, that actually makes a lot of difference. Dell's pretty well known for using the Broadcom NICs for their ports on the R610s and the R710s. It was the first 4 ports in that motherboard were all Broadcom. And the Dell VIB that was on their ISO performs better than the generic Broadcom VIB that was on the VMware ISO. So it's one of those things where you might not notice that difference, but occasionally it pays off. That's the same thing. HP has their VIBs available as a separate package, but the ISO has the correct versions. You know they're correct versions. They're frozen at that correct version number. You get support because they know, and they're not going to refuse you hardware status support anyway if you pay them enough, but you know that the support guys, when they're supporting ESX and they're trained internally on ESX, were trained using that internally done ISO. So there's the big advantage to that. And then to go back to the OpenManage one, the OpenManage is something you want to put, I would say put it on all your Dell ones, even if you don't use it, unless you're in an environment where the security posture just doesn't allow management through that kind of third-party software. But the OpenManage is mainly targeted at Dell's OpenManage solution and not as much at the vCenter hardware status. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so, and I'm just going to throw in a little anecdote too.
Anthony, you still with us?
Anthony, did we lose you? We lost you at anecdote. Anthony? I guess he's not anecdoteful.
Might be demonstrating what happens when you don't use the right ISO.
He's miming it.
I am back. I was talking to myself. It turns out I'm using my phone for this and a headset, and my new case that I just got today, I can actually press the hang up button through the case.
Nice.
So I hung up on you guys. Sorry about that. I was just going to interject a little bit. One thing with the HP CD, I had somebody in my team who's not terribly familiar with vSphere and ESX in general give an install a try on a new Gen 9 server, and they were telling me, well, it must not be compatible with the new Gen 9 server. It won't even install or it won't even find the hard drive. And I looked at it, and it took me about 26 seconds to realize that he wasn't using the HP image, and it couldn't even find the controller to install ESXi on. So, I mean, you may not get some metrics, but you may run into an issue where you can't even install it.
Yeah, no,
So,
definitely. And you may, this gets it, we're getting off into the weeds a little bit, but for those of you who want to build home labs, you'll want to roll your own ISOs because, for example, a lot of the home servers, you don't have Ethernet driver support. Mac Minis are really popular for home servers because they're tiny, they're quiet, and they're actually fairly powerful, but the Ethernet drivers weren't supported in 5.1 and 5.5, but you could make your own ISO and you could slipstream it into, slipstream that VIB in there, and then you can install on it. And there's another reason to take Optimize and Scale because it covers making your own install bundles. So, yeah, throwing another little thing there. And in the other fun anecdotes about vendor ISOs, HP middle of last year released a ISO for 5.5, and then almost immediately had to pull it because they had installed 2 versions of their network driver on there. And when you would try to install your host on there, it was incompatible and it would roll back every time. So the vendor ISOs are usually your best bet. Always check the release notes. Sometimes those suckers are going to come right back. So never take anything for granted. There's no guarantee anything's going to work. Remember, the computer is conspiring against you. So to advance on a little bit, and I'm looking at the clock here, and I just realized we've already done 45 minutes of this, and I'm still on the first objective, so I probably need to shut up. But so we're circling back around a little bit. So you're troubleshooting common issues. Your vCenter server service. Is your service running? Is your database running? Which is 99% of the time why your service isn't running. Those of you who have SQL servers SQL Enterprise running in a SQL cluster. If you've noticed, your vCenter service will stop when you fail your cluster from A to B because it's not a true active-active cluster. So your vCenter service may go down, and it might not come back up very quickly depending on your recovery settings. So SQL Server, check it every time. Your single sign-on, which they're calling out specifically as single sign-on and not platform services controller, which is weird because this blueprint is for 6.0, but whatever. Is your machine account locked out? Did your domain do a rollback, and did you lose the trust account for the SSO? If you're doing SSO or the platform services controller in the Windows install, this is a big one, especially if you work in a large enterprise with lots of domain controllers. The environment I'm in right now has 15 domain controllers spread across the country. And if one of our lease lines goes down overnight, I come in the next morning and I've got 50 machines that can no longer talk to the domain because their trust relationships were all rolled back. When that happens to your single sign-on, that's bad, especially if you're running Orchestrator or Composer, because those have to be able to talk to the SSO components of Platform Services Controller to be able to authenticate to your vCenter and actually do their work. Composer especially. There's nothing like walking into a VDI environment in the morning and finding your 500 VMs down because nothing got recomposed overnight. It makes for a great 8 a.m. phone call. So check your machine accounts. That's going to be probably 30 or 40% of the time when your single sign-on just straight up doesn't work. If you're using the service account instead of the machine account, check your service account. Someone might have gone and saw that that account hasn't been used in a year, because remember, the account age only checks interactive logins, and they might have gone, oh, well, this hasn't been used, we don't need that anymore, and disabled or archived the account. So that's a big thing too. The next thing too, there's a I don't have the KB number off the top of my head. There's a KB that goes through relinking your vCenter and your inventory service and your vSphere web client to the single sign-on component. That KB looks intimidating, but it's really not actually bad. If you've checked your SSO is up, your platform services controller looks good, your trust account is good, your service account is good, you still can't log in, it's still reporting single sign-on errors, go through the KB article, relink your vCenter, relink your inventory service, relink your web client. Or actually, if I'm going to do that in order properly, relink your inventory service, relink your vCenter, relink your web client, in that order. And that's going to cure the other 60% of the problems. And actually, I just picked up a nice tip from a guy today. The SSL certificate tool will automate a lot of that process for you. So the Platform Services Controller will actually help you take care of that if you go through the process of issuing you SSL certs. Because if you replace an SSL cert, it has to relink anyway. So you might as well take advantage of a GUI because the scripts for it aren't really particularly fun. There's a lot of typing. And you can't copy and paste because it's a CLI. Your vCenter server connectivity. Notice I got firewalls in there. Any of you guys who've worked in a DoD environment and have had to use the HBSS, the host-based security that the DoD puts out, any of you guys have had an information assurance person who goes and accidentally checks the wrong box and all your stuff goes down because your firewall started blocking everything except port 80. That's going to be familiar to a lot of people. Windows firewall. The vCenter installer will automatically open holes in the Windows firewall when it can. But sometimes it can't always. Sometimes someone makes a group policy change, screws up your Windows firewall. Firewalls probably explain half the times I can't connect with vCenter. Is your vCenter talking to your database? Check your ODBC connection. Check to make sure your database server is running. Is it talking to the PSC, the Platform Services Controller? Check your firewalls on there too. If you're running the PSC as an appliance, make sure the appliance is started on the same VLAN. Make sure you don't have a network partition. Hosts. Make sure you don't have a network partition. Make sure your host's DNS records are correct and you have reliable DNS services too. That's always a gotcha. I've been working with an environment where DNS is there some days and not there other days. And if your DNS is down, all of a sudden you're not going to be able to talk to those hosts. Also, and this is a fun one, the checkbox, if all you guys have configured a VM kernel port, there's a checkbox there for enabling management of that VM kernel port. The management checkbox doesn't actually enable management services or disable management services. You can manage an ESX host on any IP address that is assigned to a VM kernel adapter. what that does is enable HA heartbeating. So make sure you're actually connecting to the right VM kernel port. If that host is in DNS with multiple IP addresses in the same host name for multiple VM kernel adapters, you might not be connecting to the one you think you are. So double check that, prune your DNS if you need to, but that's a big gotcha, and that's one that's not really easily uncoverable until you've run into that in the field. And then you go, oh, but don't put your other VM kernel adapters in DNS is really the long and the short of that one. Keep it at your one management IP address, and you're good. The other components, the big components you run into in the field, vRealize operations. vRealize Automation Center is another one. I don't have it on here because when you don't run it, wow, I can't speak. When you have the vRealize automation and you're not talking to vRealize automation properly, you're gonna notice real quick, and that's never fun. VRA really depends on its vCenter. You'll notice that fast. Composer. For any of you guys who work in a VDI environment and use Horizon, the Composer is your best friend and your worst enemy. The Composer will sometimes just lose synchronization with the vCenter. I've never been able to pin down support and actually figure out an engineering solution to this, but restarting the Composer and restarting the vCenter fixes it. If you do use a VDI environment, though, your view dashboard is going to be your best friend. Make sure your SSL certificates are there. Make sure they can talk. It uses a couple special ports. Make sure those are there. Don't move around virtual machines without telling the Composer you're moving around virtual machines. You got to modify your pools, or else it's going to throw all sorts of errors. You're just going to have a delightful day. Orchestrator depends on the web services APIs, so it depends on those additional vCenter services. So not just the virtual center service, but the web management services. It doesn't depend on the web client, though, but you will need the web management services and the API access for Orchestrator to work. And then, of course, virtual machines. So contention, configuration, operation. And I got your big four right here: CPUs, RAM, I/O, which is storage, and network. And if I could do a show of hands, if we're all in a room, how many of you guys have been asked to size a VM for something crazy like 16 vCPUs and 128 gigs of RAM, because that's what someone bought a server for once upon a time? That's a great way of killing all your virtual machines, not just that one virtual machine. Because remember, if I give a VM 4 vCPUs, I need to schedule time on 4 processor cores to be able to process that. So I've got pretty beefy hosts. I've got hosts with 16 physical cores. But if I'm scheduling something that needs 4 cores, I've just taken out a quarter of my host resources. And it might be for one instruction cycle, but I need to lock 4 cores. Those 4 cores now can't do anything else for that one cycle. I've got 6 VMs, all with 4 vCPUs. Suddenly I start scaling up on those. All of a sudden, that's when you start seeing lots of CPU ready. That's when your performance goes absolutely downhill. The RAM is another one. RAM is not really as bad. You can pretty much massively over-provision RAM on a couple VMs and get away with it. The ballooning driver will save you. Transparent page sharing. If you've ever looked into that, if you've ever used that, that's actually off by default. And it's now officially recommended by VMware that you don't enable transparent page sharing because it introduces a couple of interesting security vulnerabilities. So there's a trade-off there. You can potentially recover data inside other VMs if you turn that on. But when you turn transparent page sharing on, you also get memory deduplication. I personally turn it on, but that's going to have to be up to you guys, and it's going to have to be up to your security posture. But that can save your bacon if you run into a RAM environment issue. The big thing with RAM, though, is you need to be really careful that you don't start swapping. When you start swapping to disk, especially if your hosts are not configured with SSDs, your performance is you're done. That host is going to be just so overloaded that's not going to be responsive to you. It's effectively going to seem like its management agents have failed. If you're really lucky and you're in an environment where everything is boot from SAN, you can't swap the disk, and it's just going to start crashing VMs. So you don't want to get there. people really demand to see an absurd amount of RAM in their boxes, and I've had people ask me to configure 64 gigs of RAM on 32-bit OS systems with no address extensions. They can't even support it. Give them their 64 gigs of RAM and then implement a limit on it. Limit it to 3 gigs. It'll look like it's got 64 gigs, but the host is going to know better. But ideally, right size. Check your performance charts, see how much it's actually using, right size, and if you're in the kind of environment where you can get away with it, make sure you push back against the end users who are requesting those kind of ridiculous specs. Storage IOPS are one of the ones, the next one, and that's one of the ones that's actually a little troublesome to troubleshoot here, because in a quiet environment, you're not going to see this except when it spikes up, and then it doesn't immediately present itself in, oh, hey, my IOPS are off the charts, I'm really hammering my array. What you're going to see is you're going to see your storage latency shoot through the roof. That one's tough to troubleshoot from the GUI. You can get to it from the advanced performance charts. You can also get to it from the CLI using ESXtop. ESXtop is also a very valuable tool. And I'm going to page away from this for a second because I have a friend of mine who actually just sent me a very good fling here, which I'm going to paste into the chat. I'm not able to paste it into the chat, but I'm going to paste it into the organizer, and then we might be able to repeat that back out to the group. But that fling that I just pasted in, that will hopefully get repeated back out in a second, actually lets you do ESXtop directly from the web client. And I know web client's a dirty word. Oop, and my screen sharing went away.
Yeah.
Let's fix that.
Real quick, while you're bringing the screen share back, Ryan Johnson mentioned that if you go to vmwarecom/go/INF4529, you'll get a deep dive on the 6.0 certs. So it's session INF5429 VMware vSphere Certification Management for Mere Mortals.
Oh, very nice. That's a great link. Thank you. Yeah, I see you. Anthony, thank you for that in the chat. But yeah, thank you, Ryan. That's an excellent link, and that's one of those things. VMware's been improving the certification management documentation a lot. That's something you're going to want. You're going to love that, especially if you're lucky enough to be in an environment where you don't control your certifying authority. Certs are a great adventure, and not all environments will accept self-signed certs. Financial, especially, DoD is another big one. You can't use self-signed. It's got to be signed by the certifying authority. So learn it, love it. So for you guys who are going back to the IOPS, for you guys who haven't used ESXtop, any of you guys with Linux experience have probably used the top command before to check your CPU and memory usage. So ESXtop will give you host CPU, will give you host memory, but what it really is valuable for is breaking down the performance statistics of these specific virtual machines. So you can see your VM processes on there. They're called worlds. And I can also see my host processes too, so I can check the host overhead of being imposed. But for storage, I can actually keep real-time track of the latency both by storage adapter, by LUN, and by virtual machine. So there's a couple of management tools that you can buy that'll plug into that. Of course, there's vRealize Operations, which is very good. I always had a product called Zangati in my environments, which was excellent at keeping track of that kind of stuff. And when your storage latency starts spiking, that's when it's honestly a little bit time to panic, much more than any of the other things. CPU ready will slow your boxes down immediately. That's another thing you want to use ESXtop for. It's invaluable for finding that. Much easier than using the advanced performance charts. But CPU ready is pretty easy to fix. You drop a couple CPU cores. If you're swapping the disk for RAM, that's terrible, but it's relatively easy to fix. You reduce your RAM. Storage can be a pain in the butt to fix because you've got the actual network that's underpinning that. You've got your SAN. You have drive type. Any of you guys who have been stuck with SATA drives and told that that's your array to use know exactly what I'm talking about. You might have a array configuration performance too. You might be overheating the array in terms of what you're doing on it. Anyone who's ever had a backup admin try to take a full backup during a workday knows about that too. And all of a sudden you see your storage latency go from 2 milliseconds to 20 milliseconds, and that's when everything starts to collapse in on itself. Because remember, at the end of the day, your guests think they're on their own integrated hardware. And all of these OSs were designed around being monolithic servers where the CPU, memory, and storage are in the same box. So they're expecting storage latencies of around 1 to 1.5 milliseconds because that's what the PCI bus is going to return back to them. So you can go 4 milliseconds to 5 milliseconds and you can get away with it. It's not great, but if you can't afford amazing hardware, and let's face it, a lot of us can't, then that's good. You can run day-to-day on that. I wouldn't necessarily want to, but it's doable. You start talking 10 milliseconds, 15 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, and operations inside the virtual machines are going to start falling over without explanation. They're just going to time out. That, for me, is always the key metric to look at, is that storage latency, more than any of the other things here. I mean, so our next one is network, right? But who really overtaxes their network these days, especially with 10 gig? It's tough to heat up a 10 gig network and really bring it to its knees. It's really not hard to bring an array to its knees, especially if that array wasn't configured properly when it came out of the box. So that storage latency is going to kill you. In terms of network latency, I don't think there's a lot of people running on gigabit networks anymore. On only gigabit networks. A lot of us have gone to 10 gig in the data center. 10 gig is honestly pretty affordable these days. You can pick up, if you have pizza box servers, you can start picking up Intel cards now for $400 or less. That'll give you dual 10 gig ports. 10 gig base T has finally really launched, so you can do that. The biggest thing, of course, with 10 gig and troubleshooting 10 gig and wondering why you're not getting your full performance there is jumbo frames. Not a lot of us have bothered with jumbo frames when it came to the gigabit world because you were getting a 4% return on investment. That's a couple megs of traffic, big deal. When you are in the 10 gig land, that 4% actually means a lot. You want jumbo frames. Make sure jumbo frames is also available end to end. A big issue with running network and running jumbo frames is if your jumbo frames isn't supported on all your equipment, or if you're running older equipment, especially older 10 gig equipment, which was kind of rushed to market, the jumbo frames may actually be a performance detriment. I'm looking at you, Juniper, on the early versions of the EX2500 switch. So you want to be very careful with that. Make sure your switch stack actually supports everything. If you have NetOps people, if they're comfortable with 10 gig, if they're comfortable with jumbo frames, absolutely leverage every resource you can get. If you're managing it yourself, read documentation and then skip the documentation and Google the forum posts anyways because the documentation lies. So the jumbo frames for me have always been one of the biggest performance impacts. The other thing too is you want to make sure, of course, that one VM isn't consuming all your network resources. So that's where network I/O control, if you're lucky enough to have Enterprise Plus, really comes into handy because you can do shares there. But keep an eye on that, and jumbo frames are no longer an option. You want it. Make sure your hardware versions are correct. Any of you guys who are bringing a VM that was created on a very old version of ESX, like your old template that's been sitting around since that 4.1 days, and you're bringing it forward, well, hey, that hardware version is probably going to be old as dirt. You're going to need to update that. You might end up needing to use VMware Converter too, which does still exist, even though no one ever talks about it, to bring it into the modern age if it turns out the hardware version is so old that your current ESX server isn't even going to read it, and you don't have an old ESX hanging around to bring you up there. And of you guys who work in VDI environments, the Teradici management consoles are known for having wrong hardware versions all the time. So that one's always a gotcha. That gets me sometimes. And then VM locking. I threw that on here. It's not really in the blueprint, but this is one of those ones that will get you. If you had an ESX host go down hard, you may have VMs that stay locked, even though that's not supposed to happen. So there's a couple KBs out there. Unfortunately, I didn't look up the numbers for that, but I can try to get them in there before I post this document up. So you want to make sure if you can't start a VM, if it complains that it's locked by a host, you can determine which host owns that lock file. You can go and release the lock manually. Or the other way you do it is you actually remove the VM, add the VM, do a storage vMotion to another data store, and then turn the VM back on. That SVMotion clears all the locks. So that's your quick trick to get that done. If you can have the time to remove, re-add, and do an SV motion. Not everyone's got enough data storage you can do it, and of course if you're using vSAN, you can't SV motion that. But the vSAN is also a lot less likely to have blocking issues, so 6 of one, half dozen of the other. The Platform Services Controller. The PSC is new. It's very nice. It does your link mode. It does your SSL certificates. Of course, we have that link that Ryan was able to send out about the SSL certificates. It does your single sign-on functionality. The PSC has its own full-on KB article. And actually, I've got that one right here. It's got a frequently asked question. The KB for that is 2113115. That KB is your best friend for dealing with the PSC because it collects all the documentation for it, and that documentation is not well linked other on the website. So, yeah, you want to read that before you deploy the PSC, as far as I'm concerned. And I've honestly, and a lot of people will disagree with me on this, I still think independent. I always thought the independent SSO was a good idea instead of installing it on your vCenter, especially if you're in an environment with more than one vCenter. So I would also recommend installing the independent PSC. As to whether or not you want to do an appliance or a Windows host, that's up to you. With the PSC, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I like the idea of an appliance, but I'm still, I've been burned by the VCSA too. So like I said before, I'm not a huge fan of the vCenter server appliance, so I prefer Windows personally. But the big caveat there is you can't mix them. So if you do want to go HA on the platform services controllers, you need to make sure that you either have 2 Windows ones or 2 appliance ones. You can't do them both. So, problems with installation. We had mentioned earlier the fun times with actually doing the vendor ISOs and not necessarily be able to install off of a vendor ISO or a non-vendor ISO. When you do your installation, make sure you pay attention to what it's telling you. This is specifically for the ESX. Pay attention to what it's telling you. It'll actually give you intelligible errors most of the time. If it can't find a disk, make sure first of all, check to make sure your storage controller is online. Or if you boot from SAN, make sure your SAN's online. But then check to make sure you have the correct VIB for that particular array card. Check the hardware compatibility tables. If you're trying to install over and it fails, it'll actually produce an error. The error is usually intelligible. Read it, Google it. Someone's written a blog about it probably. If you're the first person to get it, and you hopefully are paying for support, open a ticket, and then please, please, please write a blog so the rest of us will be able to benefit from your newfound knowledge. But the error messages are there to help you, so don't skip them. For tools installation, the Windows Tools installer is actually usually pretty good. You could manually install it. If you can't get a CD drive working on your Windows guest, and this has happened to me before, there are other ways to sideload it. So, for example, if you're locked out, like you have a, I'm not thinking of any specific product, like McAfee DLP or anything like that. But if it locks out your CD-ROM drives, you have network access. You can grab the ISO for VMware Tools or the actual install binaries for tools from the My VMware, and you can move them over the network, and you can get your tools updated that way. For Linux systems, anyone who's done an install of tools on Debian is going to recognize this. It's not going to be able to install a pre-built tools binary, so you're going to need to make sure you've got GCC. You're going to make sure you have your compiler tool chain so you can install tools, and then you'll actually be able to get tools running on your Debian distribution. If you're lucky enough using CentOS, using Red Hat, using SUSE, tools is going to be pre-built. That doesn't mean you'll never have to compile it manually, though. If you've modified the kernel, then you're going to need to know tools. And you're going to need to want to look up how to do that manual installation. There's a couple very good blogs on it. Not really good in the KB articles, but there's some excellent blogs. If you're using Oracle Linux, well, you better hope that binary works, because the custom compile tools is definitely not supported on Oracle, and they'll laugh at you when you try to call them for support. But it's Oracle. Fault-tolerant networking. So, biggest advantage of 6 is the ability to support multiple CPUs and fault tolerance. And the biggest advantage that they don't talk about is the ability to actually do slightly more latency on fault tolerance networks. However, that slightly more latency means going from 1 millisecond to 2 milliseconds. If you have any latency on that fault tolerant network, your fault tolerance is really, you have to drive right by my window with that? Sorry, guys. But, so your biggest advantage...
It is DC after all.
God, that is loud. Your biggest thing with fault tolerance is going to trip you out is going to be the network latency. Because remember, your secondary VM can't do anything without getting accurate data from that primary VM. What that effectively is going to do is cause your primary VM to start pausing because it has to wait for acknowledgement from the secondary VM. If it takes too long, the secondary VM will just fail and you'll fail out of fault tolerance. And if you've promised fault tolerance, you promised that level of service availability, that's going to be another one of those things that might turn into a resume generating event for you. So that latency is very important. 10 gig, 10 gig, 10 gig, all the way. You can get away with gigabit if you're using legacy fault tolerance. If you're using multi-CPU, do 10 gig, absolutely. The other thing you want to make sure, and this one, jumbo frames. Do not apply if you don't have jumbo frames unless your networking equipment absolutely doesn't support it. Jumbo frames are going to be your best friend when it comes to fault tolerance because you're moving a lot of data. And finally, with fault tolerance, isolate your network. Don't do vMotion traffic over it. If you can avoid it, don't even do a VLAN for fault tolerance. Do a separate physical network. The big thing with fault tolerance is the data it sends is actually unencrypted, so it can be interfered with. So separate physical network is good. Separate VLAN is okay. But remember, if you saturate that port, you're going to start dropping fault tolerance frames, and now it's not going to work so good. And then we can skip the tools section. This is just the tools that were pulled right off the blueprint. But so if you guys do look at the blueprint, make sure you print out, well, don't necessarily print out, but at least download the PDFs for all of these, your installation and setup guide, your troubleshooting guide, your administration guides here, and the security guide to talk about your security posture. Out of all of these, actually the least useful, surprisingly, is the troubleshooting guide. The troubleshooting guide covers your basic stuff, and then it's honestly referring you mostly to KB articles. But if you're in a pinch, it's better to have than nothing. How are we doing on time? I noticed we're over an hour. Is it okay to keep going? Or?
We're a bit over. You're doing fine, though.
This topic is insanely in depth, and
it is.
It's easy to get. Like I said with the Optimize and Scale class, we covered this in 2 full days. So there's a lot here.
You mean you can't fit 5 gallons or 6 gallons into a 5-gallon bucket?
I mean,
6 gallons of what?
Well, you know, VMware.
Oh yeah.
If someone's offering scotch, I'll take that. I can find out what's your gallon pretty quick.
We can always schedule a follow-up to this.
Yeah. And I don't know how attendees are doing on time.
Sometimes we'll go, you know, if people are hanging out and you want to go later, you can. I've got all night to do recording. If people are willing to hang out and you have time, feel free to stay longer. Otherwise, if you have to cut it short, that's totally fine too.
Oh no, I'm happy to keep going. I hopefully I'm not boring the audience. So I know you guys are used to probably seeing the interactive labs and everything like that. And like I said at the beginning, unfortunately, my lab environment decided to go up and smoke this afternoon.
Nope, people are still commenting in the questions boxes and stuff. I'm going to have to take a little step back and let Anthony take over for the rest of this. But if you're good, then we're good.
Oh, absolutely. So, to dive a little more into storage and networking, we talked a little bit about contention, and we talked about, obviously, I/O contention. I pretty well emphasized that earlier. The biggest thing, especially for people who haven't been doing this a while, is going to be identifying what that looks like. So your network contention, I call it out here as low bandwidth, which is a pretty generic term, I know. But your low bandwidth is basically going to be, I'm starting to copy files and I'm noticing they're just taking forever. You guys ever get in a slow internet connection? It just seems to be, it's taking you ages and ages and ages to download something. That's a good sign. File transfers start failing. CIFS transfers especially are bad for this, especially if you're using Server 2008 and not 2012. CIFS 2 is not as, or SMB2, the protocol is not as good at dealing with low bandwidth situations as SMB3 is. So they'll start to just randomly fail, but you start the file transfer again and it works great. The biggest giveaway though, if I start pinging across a network and it's heavily used, I'm going to start seeing very, very variable ping times. So I'll get a 20 millisecond ping, then a 50, then I'll get a ping fail, and then I'm going to get another 20, and then what I'll get is I'll get a double ping because that ping that failed is that packet that's still going through. It's actually going to come back. So you start seeing network weirdness like that. That's a sign that you're heavily, heavily, heavily overusing your network. The other thing to check too is when you start looking at the performance charts, especially the advanced performance chart, see what your physical adapters in the host are doing. If that physical adapter is at 10 gigs constantly and it's just pegged out, you know you're overheating your network, even if the virtual machine network adapters aren't showing that. So then you start digging into the question, what's causing that? So if you have a VM in promiscuous mode, and it shouldn't be in promiscuous mode, it may be pulling packets off the network that you really don't want it to be pulling. If you got any of your guys running network analyzers, Ethereal, anything like that, Wireshark, on a virtual machine, and it's pulling traffic from the whole network, you do that on a 10 gig link, it's really easy to saturate a port on your host without even trying, especially if you're in a large campus or a busy environment. So that's not going to show up necessarily as adapter utilization because those are just packets reading off the wire. It's not actually directed at the guest because it's in promiscuous mode. But it's still going to kill the adapter on that box because you've told the switch, well, I want all possible traffic sent to this port. So be very careful about promiscuous mode, and especially on host environments. Let the switch MAC address table do its job. Only do promiscuous mode if you need it. And if you're going to do it, set aside a dedicated network adapter in the box because otherwise it's asking for trouble. The other thing you want to see is, and I know it's not 1995, we don't really run into broadcast storms anymore, but if you are seeing weird network glitches, you're seeing unexplained network failures, check that. Check your switch supervisor modules if you work in an environment that's got large stuff like that. Just look for weird packet things. It might not be contention. It's going to look like contention at first, but always check up and down the stack because you may be running over, tearing your hair out because your ESX environment isn't working right, and it might turn out to be a bad supervisor card in a Cisco or a Juniper somewhere up the stack, and it's an easy RMA fix, and you've spent a week digging into this thinking it was your virtual environment, you've implemented network I/O control, and you didn't need it. Storage contention. Your VM is just going to take forever to respond. If you've ever heard the difference between speed versus responsiveness, this is where that's going to kick you. Speed is the ability to complete a task. Responsiveness is how quickly it seems like you're doing it. You click your start menu and it takes you 30 seconds for the start menu to come up. But you're on a 10 gig connection between you and the machine you're managing. And that 10 gig connection is only used by you and the machine you're managing. You've probably got a storage problem. If you check the advanced performance charts or you check the ESX top and you see storage latency just off the charts, that's a good one. So if your storage suddenly jumps between 2 milliseconds, 5 milliseconds to 20 milliseconds, you're overheating your disk. You've got too much stuff trying to talk to that array. I don't have it on here. I'm going to add it right on here right now that I think about it. Queue depth for your LUNs. So you want to see if you're hitting a LUN too hard, and a good way to check that is to see how much you're actually putting into the LUN queue depth. That's available in an advanced performance chart. It's available through ESX top. It's not really a great diagnostic tool, but if you're seeing other things going on, it's a good way to check to see if you're really throwing too much data onto one particular LUN. It may be good to farm that off on other LUNs. Each LUN is going to have its own queue. Each LUN is going to have its own buffer. And of course, you'll also have the queue for the storage controllers themselves, and this really gets you in iSCSI land. You want to make sure that's optimized well. And then I've got it in quotes, your disk churn. So this is when someone kicks off something totally external to you, and it just craps all over your storage. Like if you have, for example, Commvault or Atomar or NetBackup plugged directly into an array, and you trigger a full backup, and you're also trying to perform a disk-intensive action in your virtual machine, that is a recipe for disaster, because I am now trying to read and write to a bunch of disks, especially if it's all one large pool, and at the same time I'm trying to suck everything off those disks at once. So I'm going to get lots of cache misses. My storage array is going to be trying to read those disks constantly, just absolutely constantly. And it doesn't really matter how large your array is for this one. This will be just as bad on an array with 10 disks as it'll be as bad on an array with 1,000 disks. Because all of a sudden I've asked for all that data off the array, and if the data I'm reading to and writing to is in the same place as I've asked for that backup to be, it's not going to perform well until that backup ends. So, especially for those of you guys who have backup administrators that aren't you, if you have to work with a backup team, you got to work with a storage team, make sure you coordinate. We'll get to it a little later, but SDRS kicking off at the same time as your full backups is bad news bears. Anything involving storage kicking off, make sure your batch jobs and your virtual machines, if you've got end users who are running batch jobs, aren't all kicking off at the same time. And if they are, they're on different LUNs. And that those different LUNs are on different disk groups on your array, because if you've got one disk group of 50 disks, you put 5 LUNs on that, and you kick off a batch job on that, you're still heating up the same 50 disks. If any of you guys have SSDs in the environment, make sure you promote to SSD if you need to. Tiering is a good thing. If you guys are lucky enough to be using vSAN, make sure your vSAN policies are set correctly. Make sure you have enough SSD for the vSAN to be properly sized for your cache. So the official recommendation, I believe, is 1 to 10 in terms of SSD to hard drive. I personally go larger than that, but it's not 100% necessary. But make sure you at least have that 1 to 10 ratio. It'll work. If you don't, it'll alarm a little bit about it, but don't push it, especially if you're going to put this in production. And then, of course, focusing more on storage latency, network latency. Network latency is bad, but network latency will happen. Any of you guys have ever played a video game and you've had 100 millisecond ping and you wonder why you can't win a match? Network latency is going to kick your butt. But TCP/IP is a very robust protocol. It's designed around network latency. TCP/IP originates from the days where network links were wireless. If you guys have ever studied the origin of Ethernet, it's the Aloha net. It was a wireless link between the Hawaiian Islands. So it's designed around losing packets, especially if you have the TCP packets are designed for retransmit. UDP packets are lossy. UDP is used for VoIP. So if you've got a VoIP environment running on your vSphere setup and you're wondering why people are starting to get dropped calls, that's a sign you're overheating your network. But network latency is workable. Storage latency is terrible. Like I was saying earlier, everything's expecting a 2 millisecond latency tops. So you start handing out storage with 10 millisecond, 20 millisecond, God forbid you get into the 30 or 40, your environment is just going to die. And it won't be a clear death. It won't be really obvious what caused it until you actually dig in there and you see the performance charts showing that kind of latency, because the VMs are just going to stop responding and you're not going to know why. So if you see that happening at weird times of day, that's almost definitely going to be storage latency. See what you guys are doing in terms of simultaneous jobs running, in terms of LUN management, in terms of disk group management. Implement storage I/O control if you can. But remember that storage I/O control will save your array, but it might kill virtual machines because it might just put those through a straw. The whole concept of the 10 gallons of storage into the 5-gallon bucket. If I've only got a garden hose, I can't deal with water main. If I got a water main worth of VM traffic and I got a garden hose getting me to my array, or I've got a garden hose of an array or a 5-gallon bucket of an array, it's going to be a bad situation. Some of this is going to only be solvable by buying new storage. Some of it's only going to be solvable by upgrading your SAN. But at the very least, you want to be able to identify the problem, and that's where you're going to want to check those advanced performance charts You're going to want to check ESX top. And I mean, really, probably 90% of the weird performance glitches that people are going to think are CPU, are going to think are RAM, are going to think are network, end up coming back down to your storage array at the end of the day. Even a low latency array, when you max it out on IOPS, will start to perform that way. You can take I work at EMC right now. You can take a fully configured VNX, a VNX 7500, and if you start hitting that thing with 300, 400, 500,000 IOPS, it's going to roll over and die because that's not what it's designed around. The latency will stay low. It's just going to start queuing traffic up, and then your VMs die. And your users are going to start demanding extra CPU, and you're going to give them extra CPU. Now you're getting CPU ready, and your performance hasn't gotten any better because at the end of the day, it's storage. So, moving on. Now that I've pounded on the storage enough, vRealize operation alerts and badging. So I wish I had screenshots for this. VRO. If you guys have vCenter with operations, VRO is your best friend, because it will actually warn you before you run into a bad situation if you give it enough history. So it takes a little bit of time to actually learn your environment. But when it is plugged in properly and when the dashboards are configured, it'll actually be capable of notifying you that you're about to run out of storage capacity or you're about to run out of storage performance, and it'll provide you estimated time to live on your arrays. So you can then communicate that back up to management and go, look, this time next year, we're going to need to step up in the array world here. We're going to need some SSD. I'm going to need flash cache. I'm going to need whatever. I'm going to need a second array. I'm going to need additional RAM. I'm going to need additional hosts or CPUs or what have you. The hosts themselves and the virtual machines will be badged based on performance. So you go red, yellow, and green. Yellow, obviously, caution. Red, it's on fire. Green, green is good. The other thing you'll see badged, you'll see clusters being badged, you'll see folders being badged. Basically anything that appears in your inventory as an entity is capable of having a badge assigned to it. So you can badge your arrays, you can badge your network, you can badge your DV switches. But VRO will plug into all of that, and once it's been configured properly, will actually let you know what's going on. So if you have network contention, VRO will provide the information, tell you how long you have to live on the network. The other really cool thing with VRO, and this is why you need to give it time to learn, is it'll let you know when things suddenly go out of whack. So if you've given it 90 days to learn, and all of a sudden someone starts kicking off a new batch job on a server that's never happened before, vRealize operations is going to actually call that out to you. It's going to throw a badge on it. It's going to say, hey, I've not seen this behavior before, and it's going to call that to your attention on the dashboard. So it's great for looking at things that are about to fall over. If someone suddenly throws a new task in the environment that wasn't there before and you need to redesign LUNs or something like that around it, VRO is beautiful for it. If you're in an environment where you need to be careful to track malicious activity, VRO can be great for that too. All of a sudden, if a server starts heating up your network to 10 gigs and it really shouldn't be talking to the internet, that's a great sign it's been compromised. VRO is extremely useful for that. You can't stop a problem before it happens, but you can at least respond to it very quickly and prevent maybe leaking all your financial information to the internet, a la Sony. You can make sure the array is not overused. You can make sure your CPU is not overused. It's a great tool. VMware has been doing a good job of selling it now as part of vSphere. The vSphere with operations is the product that they've really been pushing now. So especially if you're a new purchaser, you might have VRO already and you might not know about it, or you might not be using it. Talk to your account manager. See if you can get them to throw it in at the renewal. End of quarter's coming up. You got a week to, if you need to renew, now's the time to do it. End of year is going to be coming up soon, so you might be able to get them to throw it in in order to secure a new license or a renewal. I would encourage everyone to get it, to use it, to love it. Honestly, I like all monitoring tools when it comes down to it, but VRO is actually, now that I've been using it, is actually one of my favorites. VRO and the Zengani management tools are probably the two in my opinion, the best ones for getting your environment kind of under control. Zengati provides you really great live performance graphs, and vRealized Operations gives you that ability to see the overall picture and let you know when things just have something going out of whack. And like I said, I wish I had screenshots for you guys, but there's, for any of you guys who haven't ever used them, there's the VMware Hands-On Labs. Those are free. They're little web-based laboratories. You can log in, you can take them. You use your MyLearn account for that. And one of them covers VRO in reasonable depth. You've got other ones in there, NSX, View. There's actually some stuff in configuring third-party products to work with the environment too. And if any of you guys are in the DC area, the Reston office every so often does a hands-on lab with food, so pay attention to those because the food is excellent. But yeah, VRO, I mean, I wasn't sold on it when it originally launched, but in this current version, it's really actually fantastic. And it helps with the next topic. So you got your network and storage configuration, and I'm bad at these segues, I apologize. But to verify your network and storage configuration, if something like that suddenly changed, you would get a badge because stuff would stop working. So you got the vSphere standard switch, you got the vSphere distributed switch. The big things to check with that, the thing I always check is VLAN configurations, especially on the distributed switch. Is it a regular VLAN? Is it a trunked VLAN? And of course, that's a key difference. Or are you using PVLANs? And is your PVLAN supported all the way up the stack? So we'll touch on the PVLANs a little later, but the big thing between a VLAN and a VLAN trunk is the difference between handing out a tagged packet or an untagged packet to the underlying virtual machine. So the VLAN trunk works just like it does on the port that's coming into your ESX host itself. If you set that to be a trunk and not just a regular VLAN, you're handing a tagged packet through the distributed switch to the underlying virtual machine. So on the VM, you're actually going to have to go and configure its network adapter to the correct VLAN ID to be able to then untag that packet and process it. If it's just a standard VLAN, you'll be able to just deal with it like an untagged packet. You're just throwing the network adapter in place, and then the tagging's all handled on the host end. Probably the biggest thing I screw up personally when I configure VDS switches is to accidentally set something to be a trunk when I meant it to be a VLAN, or vice versa. It's easy to screw up. They're right next to each other in the option. They both say VLAN. I mean, they're not obviously different unless you're digging into the interface. So that's the first thing I always check. vSphere standard switch to, and the same thing with the VDS. Make sure you're on the right VLAN ID. That's another one of those things where it's like, you go and you go, duh. But at the same time, it might be 2 in the morning. You might have just spent 14 hours configuring an environment that needs to be done tomorrow, and you're burned out, and you accidentally key in a 2 instead of a 3, and everything's down, and you don't know why. Paper, it's going to be weird. I'm an IT guy, and I'm talking about pen and paper, but put it down on pen and paper. Actually write it down before you implement it. It's hugely advantageous. When you guys go and take this exam, they're going to give you the little whiteboard, the erasable whiteboard to actually go and do this stuff. And yeah, you're time limited, but for some of the stuff where they're asking you the more in-depth configuration questions, do the same thing. Put it down on the whiteboard. Take 30 seconds to write it all down and actually puzzle through it a second, and you'll avoid a lot of those trick questions. It's going to improve your exam score immensely. And especially when it comes to troubleshooting, they're all trick questions. There's no easy troubleshooting. If it was easy troubleshooting, we wouldn't have to do it. Storage configuration. Are you using iSCSI, NFS, or fiber channel storage? If you're using iSCSI and NFS, we're coming back to jumbo frames. I recommend them, but if your network stack doesn't support jumbo frames the whole way through, you might end up with very weird glitches. If you're using iSCSI, and I don't have this, so we're going to add this right here. Make sure your authentication is correct. So if you're using CHAP authentication, you're using any sort of encryption or handshaking for iSCSI, make sure that's set up right. NFS, make sure you're connecting with the correct permissions. It's going to be root permissions. Even in 6.0, 6.0 is going to support NFS with the new version of NFS that's going to support user authentication. Just do root permissions. Control that access on the NFS server itself, the NAS. Don't bother with it. It's too much work to try to it's not even so much as too much work, as too many opportunities for it to go wrong if you're configuring user accounts. Just do the same root permissions, except that that's how it's going to be, and control the actual access using IP addresses on your NAS. For Fiber Channel, LUN masking. LUN masking is going to be your worst nightmare. Make sure that you actually know all of your Fiber Channel worldwide names on both ends. Make sure, if I were you, I would configure your LUN masking always, always, always on the Fiber Channel array itself. For some of us, that's unfortunately not possible, so we have to do it on the switch with switch zoning. Or if you're really, really, really unlucky, you have to do it on the ESX host itself through the CLI. I strongly recommend against that, but if you have to, you have to. But your LUN masking is going to be critical, not only to make sure you're showing the correct LUNs to your host, but to make sure you're not showing LUNs you don't accidentally want to overwrite. Because if you got a Fiber Channel array that can't mask and you're not zoning on the storage, it's very easy to accidentally expose a NTFS Fiber Channel LUN over to your ESX host, and then one morning you're looking for new storage, you right-click, you create a new LUN, and you just erased the financials database. So be careful. And then VAI integration. That's another one of the key ones. And people in large environments, or people with NetApps, EMC arrays, the EqualLogics are going to want to be able to check that. EqualLogic, obviously, being an iSCSI-only array. The NetApps and the EMC, the VNXs, the VMAXs, and everything like that are all going to do Fiber Channel. And so make sure your VAI integration is configured. You'll get additional performance out of your storage there. That's a quick thing to check for troubleshooting too. And if you're using a third-party storage provider, so your storage providers, you've got most recently used, you've got round robin, you've got preferred path. For EMC is the one I'm familiar with because I work for them. PowerPath. Make sure you actually have that configured. If you have a third-party storage provider and it is configured, make sure you're licensed, because PowerPath will stop working if you don't have a license key for it. So make sure your licensing server is up. Throws an additional thing into the storage matrix. Make sure your storage is showing up with the correct vendor if you need to, because that's another thing. If your vendor ID is suddenly different, perhaps you're masking that for some reason, or you're masking the worldwide name, it's not going to show up correctly, and it's not going to use the correct storage path. That's a CLI command. That's almost definitely not going to be in the VCP. That's probably going to be in the VCAP, but still useful to know. Network I/O control, virtual machines and network resources. Network I/O control v3. This is a huge improvement. This is going to definitely be covered on the VCP because it is such a big change from the previous versions of network I/O control. You're no longer configuring network I/O control on physical adapters. You're configuring it as if it were a resource pool for the entire host and virtual machine. So you can create shares for different types of traffic: iSCSI, NFS, vMotion, fault tolerance, and you can create shares for individual virtual machines as a subset of VM traffic. So when you read the documentation, which I, of course, always recommend you do, use it when you have trouble getting to sleep one night, but read the documentation, look specifically at the Network I/O Control v3 documentation, because this is actually pretty interesting. The specific example they call out there is to do a 100-150 split. So you give 100 shares to vMotion traffic, 100 shares to fault tolerance traffic, and 50 shares to virtual machine traffic, which effectively makes it 40-40-20. So 40% of that network port goes to vMotion, 40% goes to fault tolerance, 20% goes to VM traffic when they're saturating the port. What's cool is if I'm not doing fault tolerance at the moment, and I'm only doing vMotion traffic and VM traffic, now my vMotion traffic gets 100 shares, my VM traffic gets 50 shares, so effectively that's a 66-33 split, which is huge because this is a massive improvement over the earlier versions of network I/O control. Anyone who's previously configured it knows what I'm talking about. But the caveat there is now I'm going to start configuring shares on the individual virtual machines. If I give two VMs 50 shares each, they're splitting evenly that 33%. They're not splitting more than that. So I've still got 66% reserved for the vMotion traffic. I've got 33% for VM traffic in this scenario with 150. Now I'm taking that 50 and splitting it 50-50. So it's easy to get into the weeds there. And it won't do it. I mean, obviously it's not going to do it for you, but you need to really evaluate the underlying VMs here. It's very difficult, very easy to kill a VM by accidentally giving it too few shares. The same thing that happens if you do resource pools and you start throwing a VM with a lot of CPUs into a resource pool that's got a bunch of single vCPU virtual machines. That 4 vCPU VM is going to kill everything else because it's going to outcompete it for the relative shares. So in an environment where you need to do this, make sure your shares are weighted properly, make sure your resource pools are weighted properly. If you have an Exchange server, don't put it in the same resource pool as the one FTP server that gets used twice a month, because the FTP server is never going to be able to get any traffic out. Make sure your shares are allocated correctly, obviously, but get them in separate pools and give those pools shares yourself. SDRS, Storage Distributed Resource Scheduler. So everyone's used DRS. That's how the clusters work. A lot of you guys now have used SDRS. SDRS was there before it really finally took off in 5.5 and 6.0. It's really pretty smart. But your caveats are going to be, of course, all your hosts are going to need to be connected to everything you've got in a data store cluster. That's the easiest one. If you have a temporary interruption on your SAN fabric, if you're using NFS and something gets blipped real quick, if you're using iSCSI and something gets blipped, it's really easy to temporarily lose a connection there. And all of a sudden, your SDRS schedule isn't going to work right. So make sure they're all there. Make sure everything's showing up connected. Your SDRS window is going to be the time where it's going to be allowed to do the automatic storage vMotions for you. Make sure this doesn't conflict with backup jobs. Make sure this doesn't conflict with high process tasks. So if you run a batch financials job at 8 p.m. every night, 8 p.m. is probably a bad time to do your SDRS window. If you run a full backup at midnight on weekends, SDRS probably shouldn't run that. So you want to balance that out, and it's very important that you balance that with the other things in your array, or we go back up to where we were talking about array overheating. And the biggest thing to take away from both of these, network I/O control, SDRS, storage I/O control, limits seem like a great idea in theory, but those are, when you're doing limits, those are hard limits. Shares are easy. Shares are also easy to screw up, but shares are a lot safer, and this is my personal opinion. People disagree with me on this, but I think shares are a lot safer and a lot more tolerant than limits are. If I have a VM that I absolutely know doesn't need more traffic than it's generating now, I'll implement a limit. But otherwise, I'm going to want to do shares. I'm going to want to be very careful about balancing that. So I'm going to prioritize, say for instance, my PBX. I'm going to prioritize my Exchange server. I'm going to prioritize my SQL server. I'm probably going to deprioritize the tertiary web server because one person checks that to see the lunch menu every day. But I'm not going to want to limit that because suddenly everyone wants to see the lunch menu. Why would I limit the bandwidth to it? I can give it the shares, but if no one else is using the SharePoint or using the Exchange or the SQL server, and everyone wants to see what's for lunch at the cafeteria because it's Taco Tuesday, a limit's going to cause that to absolutely be saturated down. It's going to cause denial of service. But shares are going to let me scale that up because it's going to gracefully trade off. Connectivity issues with VLANs and PVLANs. So I talked about this a little earlier with the VLANs, making sure your VLAN is a trunk or a VLAN and making sure you're using the right one. And I said I was going to come to PVLANs, and we've arrived. So your PVLAN is a private, so P is private VLANs. It's a VLAN encapsulated within a VLAN. So it's if you guys are familiar with network protocols, it's the Q and Q tagging. It's separate. It's VLAN encapsulation. Your switch needs to support this. Not all switches support VLAN tagging in the first place, so switches don't have to. Switches won't drop a VLAN tag packet. A lot of switches that support VLANs will drop Q and Q tag packets if they're not expecting it. So make sure those PVLANs are set up on your switch. If you're using switches that have MAC learning, this is called out specifically in the network configuration guide, make sure the MAC addresses are set in that switch so it knows to be able to learn them. I put this one in here, the third bullet point, ensure that you really meant to use a PVLAN, because there's lots of times when you don't actually mean to. VLANs, I mean, you get 4,096 VLANs. That's a lot of VLANs. Unless you're in a huge environment, unless you have network IO people, or network operations people who are very, very stingy, there's a lot of times a VLAN is going to be better for your needs. And then know your PVLAN types. Your promiscuous PVLAN can talk to everything. It can talk to the network. It can talk to all virtual machines in the PVLAN family. And the VMs on it can talk to each other. This is honestly pretty cute. This always threw me off. But so think about it like you've got people in a room. Some people are wearing blinders and earmuffs. Some people are wearing radios that can talk to other radios on the same frequency. And some people have no earmuffs and no blinders at all. Your promiscuous guys are the ones without the blinders, without the earmuffs. They can hear everyone. They can talk to everyone. The isolated guys have blinders and earmuffs. They can only talk to the promiscuous group. So that's effectively how you would do a isolated DMZ. Say, for example, I have a group of servers that only need to be able to talk to one server and have no need to talk to each other. I put one server in a promiscuous PVLAN, and then I create a sub PVLAN, which is the isolated one, and I put my other servers in there. So they can only all talk to the machine on promiscuous. They can't talk to each other because they are isolated. The community one is a private VLAN, a sub-private VLAN, that is able to talk to the promiscuous, but is also able to talk to itself. So for this one, I have servers that are allowed to function in a cluster and still need to be able to talk to the external control server and the promiscuous VLAN, but don't need to talk to the internet. A community PVLAN is useful for that. But the community stuff still won't be able to jump over into the actual VLAN, the full parent. The example VMware uses in their documentation is a student lab versus a server farm. The server farm is the isolated, the student lab is the community, because the student lab, no, I reverse that. The student lab is the isolated because they only need to talk to the servers. The community is the server farm because the servers need to talk to each other. I'm not in love with that example, but if you read through the documentation enough times, it eventually starts to make sense. At the end of the day, I personally have never encountered an environment that uses PVLANs outside of my VCAP exam. I don't know if they're really going to be useful in the long term now that we have products like NSX available. But VMware expects you to know what they are and know how to use them. So read through the network documentation. If you have a lab and you have switches that will support Q and Q tagging, go ahead and try to configure one. They're interesting, if nothing else. And if you work in an environment that doesn't want to buy NSX but does need the isolation, PVLANs might become your best friend. But most environments that want that kind of isolation also usually have the money for NSX. And NSX is great. That's all I could say about it. If you have an opportunity, go to the hands-on lab, do the hands-on lab, and then try to get your boss to buy it. Storage and network. Check your whole stack. Don't just go, oh, I can't talk to my array must be down. Check your SAN switches. Check your physical adapters. Check your cables. This is where it gets into the, I mean, you get into the weeds here, but you might have a fiber cable that's slightly degraded. Maybe someone nicked the sheathing on it. Check if you're running a long area or a metro network, have a fiber technician actually go and check the fiber splices. I had a 10 gig metro link start coming up and down, and we couldn't figure out why, and we found there was a speck of dust in a fiber splice 5 miles away from us. One dust intrusion. and that was it. It took them 3 weeks to locate this, and it took them 30 seconds to repair it. They pulled the splice, they cleaned it, they put it back together. My link never went down after that. Check the whole stack. For networking, same thing with networking. Supervisor cards, switch ports. Sometimes switch ports will go bad. Switches themselves. There's something that got passed around on the Windows NT Systems Administrators list about a Cisco switch. I believe it's the 3600s or 3650s, where the reset port is located directly above port 1. And so if you plug in an Ethernet cable with a cable jacket on it, it hits the reset pin and your switch reboots. So, yeah, you never know what's going to get you on this. Check the whole stack. Check your DV switch. Check your standard switch. Make sure your VLANs are set up properly, VLAN trunking. I can't emphasize that enough. I've switched those probably 20 times in the past year. Check your destinations. Make sure your destination is actually alive. You might not be able to ping it because it's actually on fire. That's a thing that happens. Check your physical adapters on the host. Make sure they're not set to the wrong Ethernet negotiation type. These days, you always want to auto-negotiate, especially gigabit and 10 gig ports. But if you have, say, for example, 100 meg management ports because you're using hardware from 2002 for some reason, make sure those are set to full duplex or half duplex as your switch needs. Check the switch ports and make sure they're set to auto-negotiate. Link aggregation groups, if you're using those, make sure your beacons are set correctly. So if you're doing hashing, make sure the hashing is set correctly on both ends. Make sure it's set to notify the switch if that's supported on your switch. LACP, Link Aggregation Control Protocol, is finally supported. It was supported in 5.5 through the web client. It's supported in 6 through the web client, and it actually works really well now. I like LACP better than the old school Cisco style hashing. It lets you split stuff off across multiple switches in ways you couldn't do with the old school hashing. It gives you the ability to do better HA paths, use it, love it, but check the configuration, because if you have LACP set to active on both ends, your link will never come up. If you have it set to passive on both ends, your link will never come up. It needs to be active on one end and passive on the other. That's a big gotcha. Check your... This is a tool I've never used, but they called it out in the documentation specifically. VMFS metadata consistency, the on-disk metadata analyzer. This was introduced in 5.5. It is the file system checker for VMFS. The KB article, I wrote it down here because, I'm serious. I had never even thought of this product until I saw it in the blueprint for this. I've never personally run into an environment where I've had to use this, even after having an array hard crash out under me. But, it might happen. And they called it out in the blueprint, so they're going to ask you about it. And in all caps, this is not a substitute for backups. This is not a substitute for backups. This is not a substitute. The documentation itself, it calls it out like 4 times. It's always recommended to have a backup of an array, especially when you're running a file system check. All changes it writes out to that LUN are going to be permanent and they're going to be instant. So if you have a VM on there and it was working, but the array had some slight corruption, you correct corruption on the LUN now, but you may have hosed that VM. Backups. Image-based backups are good. Agent-based backups are good. A blend of them is the best. I think I covered it a little earlier. You can't take a file system snapshot of a SQL server without quiescing the disks and expect to have that ever come back up. It might come back up if you're really lucky, but a lot of times it won't. SQL servers need agent and backups. But you still need that snapshot backup because you're going to need to be able to recover the operating system at some point. So, blended backup approach. Obviously, that's not that part of the troubleshooting. That's covered in a whole other topic. But, there's 2 kinds of people. The people who haven't had a hard drive crash, or the people who have had a hard drive crash, and the people who are about to. I once walked into my apartment to the sound of a hard drive making an angle grinder noise. It's a bad situation. I've seen storage arrays physically shooting sparks out the back. It's your backups are invaluable. And offsite the backups. I know this isn't troubleshooting, but there's a backup in only one location. Might as well just be no backup at all. If it's important enough to back up, it's important enough to back up twice. But yeah, metadata consistency checker. It's called on the blueprint. They're going to ask you a question about it. If any of you guys ever actually use it in real life, please drop me a note, because I think that would be really interesting, because, I mean, I've talked to people at support who don't know this thing exists. Upgrades. The first thing they're going to ask you to do on the exam is to collect a diagnostic upgrade bundle. Thankfully, that's really easy, and thankfully, of course, this exam is not actually a practical exam. It's a multiple choice, so you're going to be able to do a multiple guess on this one. For Windows installations, the wizard offers you a log roll-up zip file. So when your Windows upgrade fails, it's going to typically provide you that zip if it fails into a consistent state, and it's able to, especially if it's able to roll back. Otherwise, and we've got another siren. I apologize. Oh man, I'm gonna mute real quick.
Hey, this is a good time for me to interject. Actually, I found the KB article for vSphere on-disk metadata analyzer, which I haven't heard, and we've had some comments of people that haven't either. So I'm going to paste this link in the all chat for everybody. So if anybody's still awake and out there, check the chat window and read that at your leisure.
I mean, before looking over this blueprint, before looking over this blueprint, I had really never heard of that product before. My metadata, the only things I've ever done on a VMFS are typically dealing with repointing things from bad snapshots, which, by the way, not another thing you really want to be doing, but I think it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. If you're ever messing around with a LUN, if you're ever messing around with the file system, stop, call support, start again. Even if you know exactly what you're doing, it's at least worth having a low severity ticket open, because that way at 2 in the morning when something has gone haywire, someone has already reviewed the case notes and maybe has offered a couple of suggestions. The support people are your friends. Honestly, the night support people are pretty cool. If you're in federal support, you're eligible for federal support, those guys are great. Education support has been good for me. I've never had to use commercial support, actually, so I can't speak to them, but I've heard good things. Do it on Thursday nights with federal support, and they might be playing Destiny, so your responses are going to be a little slower, but it happens. But, I mean, open support tickets. This isn't going to be covered on the exam topic, but open a support ticket. Support your friends. And for the love of God, pay for support. If you're using this in a production environment, pay for the production support. One of these days is going to happen to you. It's going to be 3 in the morning. Something is going to have broken, and you're really going to want a friend on the other end of that phone. I've spent 8 hours on the phone with support people before and been able to recover stuff that really should not have been recoverable. But at the very least, if it's not production, at least have basic support so you can open an email ticket and get someone who can search an internal KB and give you some documentation that you're not eligible for. The internal stuff is fantastic, and a lot of the times the reason it doesn't make it out to us on the public KB is because it's not stuff you want to be doing unless it's a last-ditch situation anyway. Open support tickets. So going back to
and speaking to commercial support, we had a few other people comment too. Their commercial support is the next best thing since sliced bread. So I've never had a bad experience with their commercial support, and they're definitely the friends on the side of the phone that you want.
Oh yeah, there's nothing like having someone on the phone. At the very least, even if the environment is hosed, at least you've got someone else who can help you confirm that and back you up when you have to tell your boss that you're going to be recovering from a backup. Because that can be the difference between having someone go, well, okay, stuff happens, and well, okay, pack your desk up. Tickets are good. Pay for your production support, and I mean, you get upgrades too. And sometimes your sales rep will come and take you out to lunch. So. Going back to our upgrades, speaking of upgrades, if you're doing a Windows install and it fails consistently, it should offer you a log rollup zip in the wizard. This is, of course, presuming it fails consistently. And I don't know if anyone else has tried this, but at least in the early versions, failing consistently was difficult. Otherwise, of course, everything's always in C program data, always in program data. So remember, show hidden files and folders. The other thing I've got here, I'm going to highlight it real fast. Local app data. That's your C users app data local folder, typically. But if you're running an environment where your folders are redirected, that may be somewhere else. So that's why I threw it out there as the environment variable, which is the percent local app data percent. The temp folder in there carries a bunch of logs that you would think would have been in other places, would think would have been in program data, but they get stored there. The linked mode join log gets written to local app data temp. A lot of the upgrade logs get written to local app data temp. So if you're only collecting the program data logs, you're going to miss out on that kind of stuff when you're doing installs, when you're doing upgrades, when you're doing reinstalls or removes. So you want those. Make sure, especially if you're going to open a ticket, go collect all the logs there and send them over with a ticket. It's going to improve the processing time. At the very least, you're going to be able to open those log files and you're going to be able to figure out what's going on. And they're going to ask you the location of that on the test anyway. But it's going to be the environment variables they're going to refer to it on the test are either going to be the local app data percent or the percent temp. So I'm going to type that in here as well. That's the other one that comes up in the documentation all the time. Those two paths should be the same place if your system is configured right, but you can change all that in group policies, so you never know what you're going to end up with. But those environment variables are your friend. That's where your logs goes. The VCSA logs, if you're doing the server appliance, you have to SSH into the appliance, do vc-support.sh. It creates a log tarball, a TGZ file, tar-gzip. You'll go ahead and then, if I were you, I would use SCP to then go pull that file off there and process it on a Windows box. You can expand it on the VCSA and you can read it through VI, but I don't know about you guys. VI is not my world's favorite text editor. I'd rather pull it up in Notepad++, so I'm going to pull it back to my host system. The database upgrades are all going to be SQL out files. If you're doing this, especially if you're doing it through an interactive install and you're doing this on a SQL server remotely, or you're doing it on SQL Express, those are going to end up in your program data and your local app data temp folder as well. You're not going to get those off of VCSA upgrade. So those are, the VCSA upgrade is still going to be done through that tarball. And if any of you guys have not had to work with a tarball before and have a Windows system, 7-zip is a great free program. You could also use WinRAR. WinRAR is technically a commercial product. You would probably be the first person to ever pay for it, but since it's commercial, don't use it in an office environment. Use 7-zip. If you're in an environment that lets you use free software, because 7-zip is a free software program. Common upgrade issues. Way back at the beginning, 2 hours ago, I mentioned database compatibility mode. If you have been bringing a database forward from server to server, from SQL Server to SQL Server, from the ESX 3, 5, or 4 days, first of all, man, you must be drinking something good. Second of all, that database might be set to SQL 2000 or SQL 2005 compatibility, and that's not going to fly with ESX 6 and vSphere 6. So when you go and you try to use it, you're going to start seeing errors in the VPXD log saying the database is not compatible, or you're going to see that in the install log or the SQL out files. You might corrupt the database even. So you might be on a brand new SQL 2012 R2 server or SQL 2015 server, and yet your database compatibility mode might still be set to SQL 2000. So you actually need to go onto the database itself and modify that database and set the compatibility to the newer version so you can run the new stored procedures. vCenter Server Appliance does not like all web browsers. Only certain versions of Chrome, only certain versions of Firefox, only certain versions of Internet Explorer. If you're in an environment that requires you to use IE9, and I think we've all been there and done that, pick another browser. VCSA's new web install thing is also not the most reliable thing in the world. So if your network bandwidth is kind of low, it's probably not going to work. So hardwire in. Don't use Wi-Fi. Chrome, I've had the most luck with Chrome. Firefox has been pretty good to me. IE11 has worked at least a couple times. And I rebuild my home lab a lot, so I've tried all the browsers. I have yet to try Internet Explorer Edge, or whatever they're calling it, for Windows 10. So if someone wants to try that and let me know if it works, that'd be cool. Chrome has still the best success rate. The web installer is very cool when it works, but when it doesn't work, it's really frustrating. I do miss the old OVA deployment system. Log bundles. So one of your log bundle methods you're going to want to do this is the ability to go in through the vSphere client and, oh hey, my laptop's going to go to sleep. You're going to want to be able to go through the vSphere client. You're going to be able to extract the logs. Off the top of my head, I cannot remember the KB that describes that in detail, but it's also covered in the basic troubleshooting documentation. There's also ESX CLI, or not an ESX CLI command, a CLI command on the ESX box that will wrap up a log bundle for the host itself. And there's a tool that'll generate logs. And now I'm going to have to pull up the troubleshooting guide because I feel bad not actually giving you guys these specific things. But so we'll come back to that in a second. Unless you can remember off the top of your head, can you?
I found collecting diagnostic info for ESX, ESXi. Exactly, I think what you're talking about, and I will paste that in the all chat window for people.
Thank you. Yeah, that's exactly the one I'm talking about. And so that one is, that's, okay, that KB is what they're going to basically ask you for. They're going to ask you the step-by-step in the exam for that. Once again, that was something that used to be a VCAP question. Now it's a VCP question. So the VCP has gotten harder. Alternative methods to upgrade your ESX host in case of a failure. If you've been doing Update Manager, which is, of course, the recommended way to upgrade your host, and it's bouncing back at you, first things first, check to make sure you don't have an incompatible VIB. Your vendor ISO might be better than the regular ISO for this. But if it's not working, honestly, clean install. Skip the rest of them. But your other optional upgrades, you can install, you can actually connect over to the box, you can copy over the new files and you can boot off of them, which is a supported method. You can do a upgrade in place install off of an ESXi ISO, or you can just blow the host away and do a clean install. Downside to blowing the host away and doing a clean install is that you're going to have to reconfigure it. But if you have host profiles, that's not really that much of a problem, and you're guaranteed to be starting from a consistent state. But yeah, for the exam question itself, they're going to be asking you, so it's going to be Update Manager, it's going to be manually copying the VIBs over and doing an install on the box, which is what Update Manager is doing anyway. Going to be booting off the ISO and doing an upgrade in place, and then it's going to be doing a clean install. If you're using auto deploy, you can clean install using auto deploy, or you can upgrade in place using auto deploy. 6 of one, half dozen of the other at that point. I'd prefer to use persistent auto deploy and do the Update Manager updates if it's successful, and if not, I prefer to do clean deployments. If you're using non-persistent auto deploy, this doesn't apply to you anyway because you'll just be recreating your boot bundle. vCenter server logging options. The biggest thing for this one is to be very careful when you start turning these on about your database space. So for the logging options, you're going to actually go into the vCenter server and you're going to configure the log level through the vSphere client. What this is going to do is it's going to start recording additional data on the performance charts for your main performance thing. The other thing you can also do is you can turn on debug logging, which is going to be another KB. And then you can do debug logging, which will write out additional data to your VPXD. I've never personally needed to use debug logging. The standard log data written into the VPXD log has always been enough. But engineering might ask you to do it. So they're going to cover it as an exam question. And you're going to want to look in the troubleshooting guide and actually look at how to do that. And once again, I wish I had the lab so I could show you guys the checkboxes for it and show you guys actually how to go configure that startup setting. But we'll maybe be able to reconvene and do that. And of course, there are blog entries and there are KBs on this. Thankfully, you're probably never going to encounter that in real life. You'll do it as an exam question. You'll be able to multiple guess it, and you'll be done. Moving on to Objective 7.4 here, monitoring. So we've kind of covered some of this stuff already, actually. You've got the vRealize stuff right here. It's called out in your first topic. So you've got CPU and memory uses, which are badges. Remember what I was saying before about behavior that has changed. This is really where those badges are going to come in handy. So if I got a host that's been steady state for months and months and months, and suddenly its CPU usage spikes up, it's going to get a badge. It's going to call itself out in your dashboard and vRealize operations, and you're going to want to go take a look at it. Same thing with virtual machines that way. The other thing they're going to do is when it looks like you're about to run out of space, or you're going to exhaust that space soon, they'll get badged, and you have the opportunity then to go and administratively take action and clear off space on an array, delete old VMs, provision more CPU or RAM, so on and so forth. CPU and memory contention. This is a fun one. If you, like I was saying before, with CPU ready. So I don't, and I apologize if I'm getting into something you guys already know, but since I don't know the skill level of the audience here, let me break down CPU ready real quick. CPU ready is what happens when I have a virtual machine that needs to be scheduled onto the processors, but there are no processors available to handle it. You see CPU ready a lot when I'm asking for a lot of physical CPUs. So if I have, I think I said before, a 4 vCPU machine, I need 4 cores, either hyper-threaded cores or physical cores. I need 4 cores available to service that machine anytime I need a CPU instruction. I can't just lock 1 core if I only need a single-threaded process running on that box. That box gets 4 CPUs because it's expected to be actual hardware. So if I've given a machine 4 vCPUs and it really only needed 1, I've now made it 4 times less likely that it's going to actually be able to get processor space. So if I have a 4 physical CPU box, say like a dual core system, which really no one runs anymore, but we'll just use it as an example, or a single socket quad core. How about that? So I've got 4 physical CPUs, and I've got a 4 vCPU VM. Every time this VM needs to process an instruction, it needs to lock every CPU in that box, so no other VMs can do anything at the same time. So it's going to spend a lot of time sitting around waiting for CPUs to clear up for it. So that's CPU ready. It's saying, I've got time, I've got an instruction, I need to execute the instruction, I'm sitting here waiting. CPU ready means your VMs are either massively over-provisioned in terms of CPU cores, or it means you have way too many VMs on the one box. And that balance is kind of tough to find sometimes. VDI environments especially. VDI environments are VDI, virtual desktops, are one of the only environments where you're going to see a lot of CPU-bound processes instead of RAM-bound processes. So if you look at that and you look at CPU contention, you're going to see a lot of machines that are powering up all at the same time and they really want to use the CPU. And so you're going to see high CPU ready if you're CPU bound. In a server environment, you're going to see high CPU ready when you typically let administrators come in and demand these 16 CPUs their product says it needs because it was designed around a physical environment and it's actually single-threaded and runs on 1 CPU and it pegs it half the time. Database administrators are kind of notorious for this. Exchange administrators are really notorious for this. Web servers are really notorious for this. You got product owners who are going to come to you and go, well, this needed 4 CPUs and 16 gigs of RAM in the real world, so I demand it has that in a virtual machine. And you'll give it to them, and they're going to wonder why the performance is bad, and then they're going to blame it on virtualization. They're going to say virtualization is unacceptable, it's not ready for prime time, and they're going to become a VM hater. What you want to do, especially if you have vRealize operations, is you're going to want to go leverage the tools there, leverage your ESX top, keep an eye on that box and see what its CPU ready time is and see how much it's actually using those cores. And then if you can convince them to, or if you can't convince them to when they're not looking, you throttle back the CPUs. You give them 2 cores instead of 4, or you give them 1 core instead of 2. And then see what the utilization is. And if it performs too slowly on 1 core, if it pegs the core, give it another one and see if it helps. You might have a single-threaded application that can never use more than 1 core and just demands a more powerful box. Or you might have a machine that is multi-threaded, and so it runs out of a single core, but on 2 cores it performs fine. But you always want to size up in a virtual environment. You never want to size down if you can avoid it, because if you start with too large, you're going to not only hose performance for that virtual machine itself. When you're running high CPU ready, you run the risk of hosing performance for everything else on that box. Memory contention is a little easier because it's easy to see how much memory you're going to use. The balloon driver is going to save you a lot of times in memory contention, because if I give 3 virtual guests 64 gigs of RAM and I only have 128 gigs on the host, but they're really only using 32 gigs each, they will balance out because the balloon driver will go ahead and will expand and will free up memory. So the balloon driver is actually running inside the guest. It looks and says, okay, I'm not actually needing this memory, so it tries to claim memory. When it claims memory, it notifies the host, and the host returns that back to the free memory pool. If ballooning fails, your next step is swapping. It's going to try to swap to the virtual machine's swap file first, which is slow. Then it's going to swap to host storage, which is usually really, 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 really slow. So keep an eye on your RAM usage. I over-provision CPU all the time personally. I don't think I've ever been in an environment where I've safely over-provisioned memory. I've done it in an emergency situation when I've run out of hosts, when I have a downtime scenario, but you don't want to do it otherwise. And that's another one where it's going to be easy to identify through advanced performance charts, and it's going to be identified through the ESX top. Look for balloon drivers, look for swap-ins and swap-outs. CPU memory limits, reservations, and shares. A limit is a hard ceiling. So if I used the example earlier of someone asking me for 64 gigs of RAM and I gave them a limit of 3 gigs. It showed up like they had 64 gigs of RAM, but that hard 3 gig ceiling was imposed, and so they couldn't actually step above that. CPU limits are going to limit you to a certain number of cycles on the CPUs, and then you're going to be done. Those are going to be done in megahertz. So if I have a 2 gigahertz processor and I limit a host to a 1 gigahertz instead of the 2 gigahertz that would normally want to try to use, it can only be on a processor half the time. Reservations, on the other hand, are going to guarantee me a minimum amount of time or a minimum amount of RAM. So if I have a machine and I've provisioned it for 1 gig of RAM and I reserve it 512, it's always going to get 512 megs of RAM on the host, no matter what. If I have a machine and I reserve it 2 gigahertz of CPU and I have a machine with 8 2 gigahertz processors, what I've effectively done is reserve that VM a single processor core at all times. It's always going to be able to schedule a processor core because it's been given a 2 gigahertz reservation. Reservations are great if you have a system that is going to need it, but they really only take effect, at least on the CPU side, when there's contention on the box. Technically, and it depends on who you ask, there is scheduling functionality in the kernel, and people are going to argue over how significant this is, but there is scheduling functionality in the kernel that will help it schedule time better if it has a reservation, if it is a process that must be very, very low latency. SQL servers, Exchange server, VoIP PBXs. Reservations, the engineering says it shouldn't make a difference, but it does. The scheduler actually does work better with the reservation on those, even if there's not contention. Downside with reservations is, remember, you're giving away capacity. So if it's a lightly loaded Exchange server, if you're in a small environment, it may not be worth having that kind of reservation on there. Shares are the big one. Shares are actually allowing, so instead of giving a hard limit or giving a hard reservation, shares allow the scheduler to do this stuff dynamically for you, but you're guiding it a little bit. So if I have an Exchange server and I want it to get twice as much RAM as something else, I could give the other box, say I want the Exchange server to get twice as much RAM as the web server. I give the Exchange server 2 shares and I give the web server 1 share. So now I have a 66%, 33% split. We talked about this with network earlier. Realistically, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to want to make my shares 100 or 1,000 so I can make it a little more granular. But the thing with shares is they're always in proportion. Shares are going to let the DRS scheduler know what I want to run, when I want it to run, and how powerful I want a particular box to be without me having to impose a hard limit or a hard reservation. Shares are the safest way to do that. Limits and reservations are definitely good, and they definitely have their place, but especially now that we're at 6.0 and the scheduler is really pretty intelligent, shares are the best way to go about it. For the CPU limits, for memory limits, for network I/O and storage I/O control, shares. To avoid limits and avoid reservations unless they're absolutely necessary. And Anthony, I think I heard you come off mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. We do have a question. You can do memory reservations and limits, but can you actually do CPU like megahertz, gigahertz limits, or is that just limited to cores? Specifically, somebody said just trying to come up with a way to round a couple of 16 CPU SQL servers that probably only need 2 cores. Can you actually do limits on megahertz?
It is actually a limit on megahertz.
Shares. Okay.
So it is the limiting factor is actually a limit on megahertz when you do the limit calculation. Effectively, that limits it to cores. But the thing is, if it's still scheduling 16 vCPUs, it's still going to try to schedule 16 vCPUs. It's just now only allowed to use those for a certain set of time. If it's got the vCPUs, though, because of the underlying architecture there, it's still going to have to schedule 16 cores at a time. It's just only allowed to do that infrequently. So in that case, a limit's really not going to help your CPU ready. I mean, there's no easy way out of that except seeing if you can talk a DBA back from the cliff edge there and seeing if you can reduce the CPU count. And especially with SQL stuff like that, I'm a big fan of taking those databases, and this is getting into architecture and design. Rather than giant monolithic database servers, I like splitting them up. So you take, I don't need a 16 CPU database server. I'd rather have four CPU database servers and split the load across them, shard the database, using either the advanced functionality that's in newer versions of SQL Server, or Oracle is great at this. It's one of the few things that Oracle is really, truly a stellar product at. But if you need a 16 or 32 or 64 or 64 CPU SQL Server, I hate to say it, but that's one of those things I would dedicate a host to. I would still run ESX on top of it to get advantage of take the advantage of HA and fault tolerance. You can't do fault tolerance on a 16 CPU box, but at least you have the ability of HA for a restart in case of an environmental failure. But I mean, if we're talking the 16, 32, 64 CPU land, I mean, I'm going to want to dedicate a host to that because it's going to kill anything else on that box. I mean, it's going to be brutal. And in the really large environments, there's a reason HP still sells the Superdome, and there's a reason IBM still sells the Z series. There's some things that are only handled on the superscale stage. But yeah, I hate to say it, but that one, the only way you're relieving the CPU ready, if you're running in the CPU ready on that, is going to be by scaling down the core count. There's nothing you can do in terms of a limit to fix that one. It'll just make it have to wait a little longer for CPU. In fact, the limit on that one would probably increase CPU ready, not decrease it. So, I feel your pain. So to end, yeah, I mean shares are the best way to do it. Memory limits and memory reservations, CPU limits, CPU reservations if you have to. And unfortunately, nothing will fix having too many vCPUs except putting it somewhere else or backing it down. Critical performance metrics. I mentioned CPU ready a lot. That's because probably it is the most critical performance metric. Memory ballooning is absolutely key in terms of identifying contention because it lets you know that you're about to run out of RAM in the box. The storage latency is the other one I really, really hammer on. Those three are probably 90% of the problems you're going to face in a virtual environment. Storage latency, CPU ready, and your memory balloon. There's obviously other stuff there. There's queue length, I mentioned before. There's the I/O per second, IOPS. Everyone chases a high IOPS number. That's available in ESX Top. It's available through advanced performance charts. the CPU utilization in terms of megahertz is a great one to show off back to the end user and say, look, you asked me for this much CPU and you're using 3% according to this scale, so how about you back it down a little bit? RAM utilization, obviously. The nice thing with the advanced performance charts, I can get memory utilization for requested, I can get it on the host, actual claimed on host, I can get it in terms of in-guest utilization when I have the active VMware tools driver. So that's a nice advanced performance chart you can pull up. But the big ones are always going to be your CPU ready, your memory ballooning, your storage latency, and throw memory swapping on that list too. But ballooning is your precursor to swapping. You want to catch it at the ballooning state. When you've hit swapping, it's already way too late. And this is, I'm not a huge fan of the blueprint design because, of course, we're right into the same question effectively with different words. Your common metrics right there. So your memory metrics, you've got host claimed and guest requested. So if I'm a guest, I'm a virtual guest, I'm going to request 8 gigs of RAM. But I might only be using 3 gigs of host memory because the rest of the stuff might just be cached memory that's sitting there that I could use, but I'm not right now. So host claimed is the one that shows you what I'm actually using. If you're reporting out to the end users, you really want to show guest requested because that'll show them how much over provision they are. CPU, of course, you've got CPU ready. You've got your CPU utilization in terms of megahertz. You can use that to calculate your percentage in the advanced performance charts. I've also got CPU run, and then I've got, when I'm actually looking at ESX top, I can calculate the difference between run and usage to determine what my overhead on the actual host is. Which, this is where we're blurring the line between VCP and VCAP. But if I have, say, for instance, a network adapter that is hugely overloaded, I can use the difference between what a guest is actually doing in terms of its CPU usage in megahertz on ESX top and what's being reported by the host. It is actual time consumed by that VM world, and use that to determine how much overhead I'm giving away to my network adapters and processing there. And then I might need to investigate, for instance, a network adapter that's better at processing TCP packets, something that offers networking offloading to reduce, for instance, the impact on a host of a highly network utilizing server. Network metrics, your big ones, packets in and out. Packets dropped is going to be a big one that lets you know if you've got a NIST configuration somewhere upstream from you that's sending you a bunch of packets you shouldn't be getting, which can saturate your network port. Obviously, utilization in terms of kilobits or megabits per second or gigabits per second. If you're actually generating that much traffic, it's going to come out as bits per second. Don't forget the bit to byte conversion, 8 bits in 1 byte. Because people are going to be saying, oh, well, I can't possibly be using that many megs a second, and they're thinking megabytes, and megabits is going to be a hugely inflated number. Your 10 gigabit link is gigabits, which is, if we were in an ideal world, like 1.25 gigabytes a second. So, yeah, realistically, 800 megs. Storage latency. I can't emphasize that enough. Storage latency is your key common metric there. IOs per second in and out. Queue depth is important, but not nearly as important as IOs or latency. And then, of course, read and write speeds in megabits. ESX top is going to be your best friend. It's CLI. If you scroll back up in the chat, we pasted out the ESX top NGC plugin, which is going to give you ESX top access into the web client. That's a fling, so it's not officially supported by VMware, but it is produced by VMware. It's got tooltips to help talk you through ESX top. If you do the Optimize and Scale class, that's a whole unit in Optimize and Scale. ESX top is extremely useful. You can see performance not just for the virtual machines, but you can see it for the host itself, for the individual network adapters, for the individual storage adapters, for the overhead and management used on the host. I mean, you can really dig into your performance. It grants you a whole new world in understanding how the host actually works and schedules tasks. Enhanced vMotion compatibility. I don't know how many of you guys have ever actually had to use this. EVC lets you take processors that are, if you have a new set of hardware that comes in and you have a cluster using, say, Westmere Xeon processors, the X56-60 series, something like that. And I bought a new set of Sandy Bridge processors, the E7s. E7s aren't instruction set compatible with the X series. But if I enable EVC on those new hardware, I can then run VMs from the older stuff on the new one without having to shut them down and move them over. The downside, when I enable EVC, I am limiting myself to the older level of instruction set. So like, for instance, if I need, I'm trying to think of a particular instruction set. So let's say, for instance, I need the encryption coprocessor that's built into the Sandy Bridge Xeons. I won't get that if I turn on EVC and limit myself to Westmere, because that processor wasn't there in the Westmere ones, and now that I've hid the instruction set, as far as the guest knows, I'm on a Westmere Xeon. Certain features, like for example, enhanced fault tolerance, the 4 VCP fault tolerance, are going to require newer instruction sets. If I need to move VMs between one instruction set to another, I need to actually shut that VM down before I can vMotion it. So when you do a hardware generation change, EVC is a band-aid. It's not a cure-all. Eventually, I'm going to have to deal with it. I'm going to have to shut those systems down. But it lets me, say, smooth over and do scheduled maintenance. Or, for example, I've RMA'd, let's say I've got HP blades. Let's say I've got a BL460 G8 blade, which is going to be equipped with an older generation E7, the Sandy Bridge. So that one goes out. HP doesn't have any in stock. They send me a G9. The G9 is compatible with my blade chassis, but I'm going to need to enable EVC on it. So I turn on EVC. I can continue using that in my current environment. Long term, you don't want to be using it if you don't have to. vRealize operations. I can't emphasize enough how useful that is in terms of performance troubleshooting for guests. You get the badging. You get the ability to determine when something has suddenly gone massively out of whack in your environment. And you get the ability to determine what's fighting for resources without having to dig into ESX top. In terms of getting a high-level understanding of what's going on, VRO is great. In terms of your boss going to be interested in it, not so much. But you can make pretty pictures and then show them how awesome your vSphere environment is. Ultimately, it's a great tool for you. It's a great tool for helping increase your availability and uptime. And I mean, you might, if you're good at talking to your sales rep and it's time for your renewal, you may be able to get it thrown in for not much additional cost. And I think it's worth it at full price. If you can get it thrown in for a bargain discount, then absolutely by all means get it. And then your performance charts. So if you've ever gone to the vSphere client, you do the performance charts. You do the regular overview. You get a whole bunch of little windows, little graphs. And you've ever noticed if you go from there to the advanced ones, they don't really look very similar. And the big reason for that is those overview ones are all done through log rollups, through performance rollups. Even the real-time ones are not as detailed as you would get through the advanced ones in the overview section. When you go to the advanced chart, it's actually pulling stats directly off the ESX server. It's pulling them in a slightly different format than it would in ESX top. The numbers are different. So like, for example, CPU ready is a big one. CPU ready is presented differently on the advanced performance chart. It's presented in milliseconds. On ESX top, it's presented in percentage. So you have to calculate it back out the percentage. But the advanced chart is just as useful as ESX top for troubleshooting stuff when you know how to read it. The overview charts are great for getting a general picture. But if you need to dig into something, you want an advanced chart. Skip the overview completely. So, moving on to HA and DRS configurations. DRS balancing. So DRS is going to DRS will vMotion VMs back and forth to try to get everything, as load balanced as it can. The biggest things you run into with DRS in terms of balancing, first of all, you might have actually increased the DRS to be a little more aggressive than you actually need it to be. So it might spend so much time vMotioning that your servers actually see a performance hit. So you want to balance how you set the DRS automation level, 1 through 5, with what's actually necessary in terms of your environment and in terms of your servers. The biggest thing, so DRS 1 might as well be DRS off. It only satisfies maintenance mode requests. DRS 1 is great if you're about to start updating a cluster and you want to know where everything is. Otherwise, I wouldn't use it. I stick most of my stuff in DRS 3 or 4. I stick desktop clusters in DRS 5 for VDI. But that's the first thing to check, is to make sure you're not overly automating and make sure it's not chasing something it's not going to get. Especially in environments where you have not very many servers and a lot of VMs per server, putting the DRS setting at 4 or 5 is really just going to murder your environment in terms of vMotion. The other thing with DRS workload balancing is, of course, since it is dependent on vMotion, make sure you're not seeing HA reconfiguration errors. HA showing up as unconfigured or uninitialized. Make sure your vMotion adapters are able to, the VM kernel ports are dedicated for vMotion, are able to talk to each other. Currently, in 6.0, you can support layer 3 vMotion. Layer 3 vMotion is good. Make sure your core and your router can handle that, because especially over a 10 gig network, you're imposing a lot of traffic. There's a reason vMotion was always recommended for layer 2. Check your latency. That's another big thing. The latency tolerance is extended out to 100 milliseconds now, but I mean, unless you're in a metro cluster, keep it under 10. HA. You have to be able to, the hosts have to be able to talk to each other. Remember, I know I said it before, I don't remember how far back now. Your HA port, your VM kernel ports, when you check the box that says management traffic, what that actually is HA heartbeating. So if you're going to do that, if you're going to check that box for that particular VM kernel adapter, make sure all of your hosts can talk on that network, because that's going to cause them to try to heartbeat to each other across that interface. And if they can't reach each other, they're effectively going to end up thinking they're network partitioned. They'll still talk to each other through the data stores, but they will think they're network partitioned, and that can be a problem. The other thing you want to look at is setting the amount of HA failover capacity. So you've got a couple ways of doing this. You can do it through number of host failures the cluster tolerates, or you can do it through percentage of cluster resources reserved for failover. Always, 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 always do it through percentage. If you do it through number of host failures, it uses the old school slot size calculation system, which heavily impacts the amount of virtual machines you can run in a cluster, because now it's sizing your cluster for the largest VM and it calculates your slot. So this gets into one of the more esoteric advanced performance areas. If I have 16 virtual machines with 1 CPU and 1 gig of RAM, and I have 1 virtual machine with 4 CPUs and 4 gigs of RAM, and I turn on slot size calculation, the slot is going to be 4 CPUs and 4 gigs of RAM, because it's based on my largest virtual machine. So if my total capacity across the cluster is 10 CPUs and 10 gigs of RAM, I can now only run 2 virtual machines in that cluster with failover enabled, because my slots 4 and 4. So I'm going to carve up 4, 8. Oh, I've only got 2 left. That's not enough to run a full VM. Same thing with the RAM. If I do percentage, it actually calculates it and determines what's powered on and what's available. So you want to use the percentage. I personally recommend doing at least a couple hosts, but I mean that's personal preference, and that's a preference in terms of what the environment can tolerate. But absolutely 100% of the time, unless you for some weird reason really need the old school slot calculation, do it based on percentage. Cluster configuration, make sure your HA settings are make sure you have HA turned on if you need it, DRS if you need it. Remember, if you're going to use resource pools, you're going to need DRS. So don't try to turn it off. For HA, also a good important thing to check is whether or not you're monitoring VM tool status inside your guests. I personally actually turn that off. It's one of the settings inside HA, because if you turn that on and it suddenly loses contact with your tools inside the VM, if the VM stops heart beating for a second, which will happen sometimes, especially if you're running host-based firewalls, virtual machine-based firewalls, it's going to bounce that virtual machine because it's going to think the VM is keeled over. That's a great way to lose an Exchange server. So I personally leave that off. If your software is tolerant of it and you're comfortable with it, you can turn it on and it'll help protect the virtual machines from virtual machine guest OS failure. DRS cluster configuration, obviously make sure you have your DRS automation level set the way you want. Like I was saying before, 3 or 4 in most environments is probably pretty good. The other thing with DRS is the ability to power off systems when they don't need to be powered on. That can save, especially if you're paying by the amp in a colo situation, that can be a fantastic money saver. Make sure you can power those back on. Make sure your IPMI is configured. Test that, obviously. But that's something you're going to want to troubleshoot, especially if suddenly you can't turn stuff back on. Make sure that's why. If you have hosts that suddenly go disconnected, make sure that you haven't accidentally turned on the power down feature and forgotten about it. vMotion configuration. Layer 3 vMotion is supported now, and vMotion over latent links is supported now. vMotion can be supported over links up to 100 milliseconds. Don't do that, but it's technically supported. vMotion you still want to do over a layer 2 link. The biggest things you'll see with vMotion, you'll see hosts not able to talk to each other. The vMotion will start, it'll hit 15, 17%, it'll just peter out, and then it'll just fail. Typically, you're seeing a network issue, either a network partition, or you're seeing a host that is trying to communicate to another host on the wrong network. Check to make sure that the vMotion ports are configured properly and the correct port is set for vMotion. Check and see that you have enough bandwidth available for vMotion. vMotion will work over a gigabit link, but a 10 gig link is really recommended, and there is a hard timeout built into vMotion. You can increase that through an advanced setting, but I really, really wouldn't. vMotioning machines that with a lot of RAM, this is another reason why you want to caution admins about how much RAM you give to a VM. When I do a vMotion, I've given that VM 25 gigs of RAM, I got a vMotion 25 gigs of data. Even over a 10 gig link, that takes a while. So if I have a gigabit link, that VM is never, ever, ever going to vMotion. I used to, when gigabit was all I could afford, I used to have an Exchange server that had 12 gigs of RAM assigned to it, and it actually used that RAM, but it could not vMotion because that 12 gigs timed out every time. So be real careful with that. Storage vMotion configuration and storage vMotion migration failures. Running out of disk space is bad. Try to avoid that. It will usually gracefully recover from that, but on occasion it doesn't. That's always going to be a support call. Make sure, of course, that your storage is shared between your hosts when you're going to do storage vMotion. Make sure that that shared connection is reliable. Losing your storage in the middle of a storage vMotion is obviously bad. Losing your vCenter in the middle of a storage vMotion is strongly recommended against. That can result in a support incident. Make sure, of course, that your storage, if you're doing storage I/O control, make sure that those I/O controls are going to support a storage vMotion. Make sure everything is correct there.
Hey, Jack, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Your audio is getting a little crackly. I'm not sure if you're on a headset or something, but I
am on a headset.
Progressively getting worse in the last minute.
How about now? Better?
I don't know. Say something.
Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
No, not really.
That's not good. I hope the cable on this thing isn't coming off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How about that?
No, it almost sounds like radio interference or some sort of crackly something. I'm not sure.
Let's try. You guys are okay with me switching the mics? Let's try that. How about this? It's going to put me on a webcam microphone, but that might be a little better.
Yeah, I think it works for now. It sounds like you're in a tin can, but it is it is audible.
Well, at least it's audible. Audible is good. So, so storage remotion, storage I/O control. Make sure you're not accidentally limiting out your storage there. Make sure, of course, that the adapters can all see the same array. Make sure that you're not make sure that you don't lose your vCenter. And for storage vMotion, really, I mean, storage vMotion is actually pretty powerful. It's smart enough to know when something's going to get screwed up, typically. The biggest things with svMotion, too, is making sure, of course, that when you're going to move a disk, you keep the type, you know what type it's going to be when it lands at the end of the day. So, move thin disks. When you do the advanced storage vMotion, you can move a disk, and you can take a thin disk and you can inflate it. You can zero it for eco zero. You can take a eco zeroed or a non-eco zeroed thick disk, and you can make them thin. That's something to troubleshoot, especially if you're wondering why a disk that was only using 10 gigs on the source end is suddenly using 100 on the destination, because you might have inflated it by accident. And this one might not come up on the exam at all, but this one has actually gotten me in the past. If you've svMotion something from one LUN and you move it to another LUN, and you can't move it to the destination LUN, browse the LUN and make sure that there's not a file that already exists with the same name. Because that's a thing. That happens sometimes. It's not really fun, but that's what happens when people remove things from inventory instead of deleting them from disk. Which is a pet peeve of mine. Don't remove VMs from inventory. Just don't do that. Fault tolerance. So we have the new version of fault tolerance now, the 4 vCPU fault tolerance. The 4 vCPU fault tolerance has pretty specific requirements. You must have a Sandy Bridge generation processor or newer, so it's going to be an E5 Xeon or newer. You must have a network link of at least 1 gigabit. That network link is required to be isolated. It will, it's not going to be able to necessarily enforce that, but the documentation calls it out as requiring an isolated network link, especially since it's unencrypted traffic. You have a hard limit, well, not a hard limit, a configurable limit of how many fault-tolerant VMs can be on the same host and how many total fault-tolerant CPUs can be on the same host. Those by default are 4 virtual machines and 8 CPUs. So if I have 4 CPUs I want to make fault-tolerant and I want to use the maximum of 4 CPUs for each one, I'm going to run into a limitation by default because I'm limited to 8 CPUs in the same host. I'm going to need multiple hosts for that. That is a configurable maximum, but like many of those maximums, it was set that way by the default for a reason. For picking up a secondary fault-tolerant VM, I mentioned way back at the beginning of this, you need to be careful about your network latency, because if you start falling out of step, that secondary VM won't be able to recover if the first primary VM goes away. The primary VMs are going to have limitations in terms of their DRS automation levels and everything like that. So you're going to need to check that. If you're expecting one to handle DRS, it's not going to necessarily work except unless you make other advanced configurations in DRS. The availability guide will cover a lot of that. And in terms of alternative fault tolerance support, the legacy fault tolerance still works and is still available. It is an advanced configuration option. So if you require the old school vLockstep fault tolerance, and it's called out in the availability guide, which means there's probably going to be at least one question on the quiz for the exam about this, you can turn that on. I honestly can't think of a scenario where single vCPU fault tolerance would be useful to me, but the legacy fault tolerance is slightly lower latency than the new lockstep system. So the new fault tolerance logging. So I would at least consider reading the availability guide and looking up that one just in case they sneak a question into the exam about it. For the DRS distribution or DRS resource distribution graph and load deviation, the graph is explaining in terms of your host and in terms of everything like that, which hosts are getting the most CPU utilization and which hosts are getting the most memory utilization. That's actually in terms of current use. The load deviation is going to be based on how much is used versus how much is free, and that's going to be a percentage. So the graph itself, the bars in the graph are going to show a little bit of that percentage. So for example, if I've got two 192 gig hosts and two 96 gig hosts, I put 48 gigs of utilization on each of the 96s and 96 on each of the 192s. The graphs will show that there's a difference in absolute quantity, but the bars will even out. And the resource distribution is going to be the same on each of those. Because the resource distribution, the target and deviation, is going to actually show as a percentage. Your target is determined by your current DRS automation level. 2 is going to have the most granular target of standard, or it's best terminology for that. It's going to have the most tolerant target for standard deviation. So if any of you guys are familiar with statistics, your standard deviation, of course, is how far away from the center of the curve you are. If I set that DRS level to 5, to the most aggressive, it's going to accept the least standard deviation from that center of the curve. I'm going to try to balance and make the load as equal as possible on all of my servers. But like I was saying before, the downside if you do that is I'm going to try to vMotion a lot to make sure I'm equal. And if I'm starting to run into issues where I can't actually work on my VMs because they're spending all their time in vMotion, they're spending all their time stunned and trying to move from host to host and chasing a low standard deviation I'm never going to get, it might be time to back that off. That's why I say start at 3 or 4, and if you absolutely need to, move it up. But I mean, 3 or 4 is probably fine. And then your vMotion map is, and hey, look at that, we're actually reaching the other thing. Your vMotion map, so with our new layer 3 vMotion, the vMotion mapping is actually is creating a logical architecture for how the vMotion works, because now that we can have it on separate networks. So the vSphere availability guide and the vSphere management guide, the resource management guide, are going to walk you through that a little more in detail. And I don't have any. My 6 environment is only a lab environment. I haven't actually had to use this in production, and my environment has not been set up with the layer 3 stuff yet, so I'm not as in-depth with this as I would like to be. But effectively, it's going to let you configure for that layer 3 environment. It's going to show you how it's laid out. Where that's going to come into play is if any of you guys have a Metro cluster. Any of you guys who've been lucky enough to work with a vPlex will know what I'm talking about. Previously, you've always had to do that over layer 2, so you're extending a layer 2 VLAN there. Now I can do that over layer 3, and I can actually have separate networks for vMotion. I'm not extending a private network across an environment. But like I said, you need to make sure your core is capable of handling that level of traffic. That's a lot of traffic, especially at 10 gig. And yeah, so our seminar has gone for 3.
Yeah, Jack, that was a ton of information, and I think we only, scraped on a lot of these subjects, but I think we're going to have to cut it off. We gotta get this wrapped up on our end, and we have all of this recorded, so it's great info.
Wait, I thought you were recording.
And I think it would be.
I'm joking. We got.
Was I recording? We're gonna.
No, you were recording.
We're gonna have to do it again. Nobody got it.
All right.
Oh God.
I'm actually going to stop the recording now so that they don't record our inanities at the end. So stopping.
Yeah.